Egypt, 1945. The Second World War has just ended, but in the quiet villages along the Nile, life continues as it has for millennia. Near the town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman is searching for fertilizer in the soft earth beneath a cliff face called Jabal al-Tarif. His mattock strikes something hard. He uncovers a large sealed jar nearly a metre tall, its earthenware surface covered in the dust of 16 centuries. For a moment he hesitates. Local legend speaks of jinns, spirits trapped in vessels by Solomon's seal. But poverty overcomes superstition. He smashes the jar. Inside, wrapped in leather bindings, are 13 codices, ancient books containing 52 separate texts written in Coptic, the last stage of the Egyptian language written in Greek letters. The pages are papyrus, brittle with age, their words inscribed sometime in the 4th century of the Common Era. Muhammad Ali could not have known that he had just uncovered one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. These texts, buried deliberately around 390 CE, contained the lost scriptures of a religious movement the early church had worked systematically to destroy. They spoke of a cosmos radically different from the one taught in cathedrals and synagogues. They described a hidden God beyond the Creator, luminous souls trapped in flesh like pearls in mud, and invisible jailers called Archons who guarded the boundaries of reality itself. For 1600 years, these ideas had survived only in fragments quoted by their enemies, in the polemical works of church fathers who sought to refute them. The Gnostics, as they were called, from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, had been branded heretics, their books burned, their teachers silenced. But here, in the dry sand of Upper Egypt, their own voices had been preserved, speaking directly across the centuries. What they said would challenge everything we thought we knew about early Christianity, about the origins of Western religion, about the relationship between spirit and matter, and about the very nature of human existence. To understand the birth of Gnosticism, we must first understand the world into which it emerged, a world in crisis, warring desperately for meaning in the face of overwhelming suffering. The 2nd century of the Common Era was an age of profound spiritual anxiety. The Roman Empire had reached its greatest extent under Trajan, stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the mists of Britain to the deserts of Africa. Within this vast political structure, peoples of countless cultures and traditions found themselves united under Roman law, connected by Roman roads, and increasingly exposed to each other's gods and philosophies. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great in 31 BCE, had become the intellectual crossroads of this world. Its famous library, though damaged by fire in Caesar's time, remained a repository of knowledge unmatched in the ancient world. In its reading rooms and colonnaded halls, Greek philosophy encountered Jewish scripture, Egyptian mysticism met Persian dualism, and the new teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, crucified in Jerusalem around 30 CE, began to spread among both Jews and Gentiles. The city itself was a marvel, a grid of wide streets lined with marble columns, its harbour dominated by the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders. But beneath this glittering surface, Alexandria seethed with tension. Jews, who comprised perhaps a third of the population, had suffered terribly during the Jewish War of 66 to 73 CE, when Roman legions under Vespasian and his son Titus had crushed the rebellion in Judea, destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and scattered the survivors across the empire. The promise of a Messiah who would restore Israel had ended in ashes and exile. For Jews and the growing number of Christians, still largely indistinguishable from Jews in the eyes of Roman authorities, this catastrophe demanded explanation. How could a good and omnipotent God allow such suffering? How could the chosen people be so utterly defeated? Why did the righteous suffer while the wicked prospered? These were not new questions. The Book of Job had wrestled with them centuries before, but in the aftermath of the temple's destruction, they took on new urgency. Greek philosophy offered some answers, The Stoics taught that suffering was the result of false judgments and attachment to external things. If one could achieve rational detachment, one could be free even in chains. The Platonists argued that the material world was merely a shadow of true reality, which existed in a realm of eternal forms accessible only to the philosophical mind. But for many, these answers were insufficient. The suffering was too immediate, too visceral, too overwhelming. Plague swept through cities with terrifying regularity. The Antonine Plague of 6580 CE would kill millions. Slavery was ubiquitous. Even free persons lived under the absolute authority of emperors who claimed divine status. Violence was casual and public. Crucifixions lined the roads. Gladiatorial games turned death into entertainment. And military service meant long years far from home, often never to return. In this context, traditional religion often seemed bankrupt. The Roman gods demanded sacrifice, but offered little comfort. The Jewish God had apparently abandoned his people, and the Christians, who proclaimed that their crucified teacher had risen from death and would soon return to judge the world, seemed to be waiting in vain as decades passed without the promised parousia, the second coming. It was in this atmosphere of spiritual crisis that a radical new interpretation began to emerge. What if the problem was not that God had abandoned the world, but that the world itself, the entire material cosmos, was fundamentally wrong? What if the Creator described in Genesis was not the true God, all but a lesser, ignorant being who had trapped humanity in a false reality? What if salvation meant not the redemption of the world, but escape from it? These ideas did not appear suddenly or from a single source. They emerged gradually, synthesized from multiple traditions by teachers who were trying to make sense of their experience. But once articulated, they proved extraordinarily powerful, offering an explanation for suffering that was simultaneously cosmic and intimate. We suffer because we are imprisoned in a world made by a false god, far from our true home in the realm of light. The men and women who developed what would later be called Gnosticism saw themselves not as innovators, but as the keepers of secret teachings transmitted from the apostles themselves. They claim that Jesus had given public teachings to the crowds but private instruction to an inner circle, and that this hidden knowledge, this gnosis, had been passed down through chains of teachers. Among the earliest and most influential of these teachers was Valentinus, who arrived in Rome around 136 CE. Born in Egypt and educated in Alexandria, Valentinus was by all accounts a brilliant and charismatic figure. He wrote hymns, letters, and perhaps a gospel, though most of his works are now lost. What survives, primarily in the refutations written by his opponents, reveals a mind of remarkable sophistication, equally at home in Greek philosophy and Christian scripture. Valentinus taught a complex cosmology that attempted to explain how the material world came into existence and why it contained so much suffering. At the summit of reality, he taught, was the ineffable Father, the ultimate source of all being, dwelling in a realm called the pleroma, the fullness. From this Father emanated pairs of divine entities called aeons, abstract qualities like thought and truth, word and life, each representing aspects of the divine nature. Together, these eons constituted the totality of the divine realm, perfect and complete. But something went wrong. Sophia, wisdom, the youngest of the eons, attempted to comprehend the Father without the participation of her consort. This was an act of presumption, of reaching beyond proper limits. The result was a kind of cosmic catastrophe. Sophia's passion, her desire to know the unknowable, produced a formless emanation, a kind of abortion or miscarriage of divinity. This entity, separated from the pleroma, became the demiurge, the craftsman who would create the material world. The term demiurge came from Plato's Timaeus, where it referred to a divine craftsman who shaped the cosmos according to eternal patterns. But in Valentinian theology, the demiurge was ignorant and arrogant, mistaking himself for the only God. This was the God of the Hebrew Bible, the deity who declared, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. Isaiah of the 45:5. His ignorance was not mere lack of knowledge, but a fundamental blindness to the higher reality from which he had fallen. Working with his subordinate powers, the Archons or rulers, the Demiurge created the material cosmos as a kind of prison or trap. The 7 planets, which ancient astronomy believed circled the Earth, were controlled by 7 Archons, each contributing to human nature and destiny. The sun gave spirit, the moon gave body, Saturn gave fate, and so on. Together they constituted a system of cosmic determinism, fate or hymermene, that bound human souls to the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. But in creating humanity, the Demiurge unknowingly included something from the higher realm. When he breathed into Adam's nostrils, as described in Genesis, he inadvertently transmitted a spark of the divine pneuma, the spiritual essence that had originated in Sophia and ultimately in the pleroma itself. This spark, buried deep within certain humans, was their true self, a fragment of divine light trapped in matter like a pearl in mud or gold in dross. Most humans, according to Valentinian teaching, were hylics, material beings dominated by bodily passions and desires, unable to perceive spiritual reality. Some were psychics, possessing souls and capable of faith and moral behaviour, corresponding to ordinary Christians who believed but did not truly understand. But a few were pneumatics, spiritual beings who possessed the divine spark and were capable of gnosis, the direct experiential knowledge of their true nature and origin. Salvation for the pneumatic came not through faith or good works, but through knowledge, specifically through remembering who they truly were. What liberates is the knowledge of who we were, what we became, where we were, whereinto we have been thrown, whereto we speed, wherefrom we are redeemed. What birth is, and what rebirth, wrote Theodotus, a follower of Valentinus whose teachings were excerpted by Clement of Alexandria. This knowledge was not merely intellectual, it was a transformative experience, an awakening that shattered the illusion of the material world and reconnected the soul with its divine source. The Valentinians described it as being like a person awakening from drunkenness or sleep, suddenly remembering their true identity after years of amnesia. Valentinus was not alone in developing these ideas. Basilides, who taught in Alexandria around the same time, proposed a different but equally elaborate cosmological system. In his teaching, the ultimate God created a series of heavens and worlds, each ruled by its own archon. The God of the Jews was merely one of these archons, specifically the archon of the 8th heaven, ignorant of the realities above him. This explained why the world contained so much injustice. It was ruled by ignorant powers who did not understand the true nature of divine justice. Even earlier, in the late 1st century, Simon Magus, mentioned briefly and unfavourably in the Acts of the Apostles, had taught in Samaria and beyond. Later Christian writers portrayed him as the archetypal heretic, the father of all heresy. The historical Simon, to the extent we can reconstruct him from hostile sources, seems to have taught that he himself was a manifestation of divine power, and that his companion Helen, a former prostitute, was an incarnation of the divine thought, who had created the angels and then been trapped in matter, forced to transmigrate through body after body until he freed her. Whether or not these specific claims are historical, they point to a recurring theme in Gnostic thought: the idea that divinity itself has fallen into matter and must be redeemed. This was a revolutionary reversal of traditional theology, which saw the divine as perfect and unchanging. In Gnostic thought, God was involved in cosmic drama, participating in suffering and alienation. Women played prominent roles in many Gnostic communities, both as teachers and as symbols of divine wisdom. Sophia herself was a feminine figure, and several Gnostic texts portrayed Mary Magdalene as a leading disciple who received special revelations from Jesus. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in the 19th century, presents her as the one who truly understood Jesus' teachings, much to the resentment of Peter and the other male disciples. "Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly with us?" Peter asks indignantly. Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? This elevation of women scandalized the increasingly patriarchal Orthodox Church, which insisted on male hierarchy and excluded women from teaching and leadership roles. But for the Gnostics, spiritual knowledge transcended gender, or rather true gnosis meant transcending the duality of male and female that characterized material existence. As the Gospel of Thomas cryptically stated, when you make the male and the female one and the same, so that the male not be male nor the female female, then will you enter the kingdom. The Gnostic movement was never unified or centralized. There was no Gnostic church, no single canon of scripture, no agreed-upon doctrine. Instead, there were numerous teachers, each with their own insights and revelations, gathering students and forming communities. They met in private homes, conducted secret rituals involving passwords and sacred formulae, and developed their own scriptures, gospels, apocalypses, and theological treatises that claimed apostolic authority. This diversity troubled the emerging Orthodox Church, which was struggling to define Christian identity in the face of persecution from without and disagreement within. If every teacher claimed to possess secret knowledge from the apostles, how could truth be distinguished from error? How could the Church maintain unity? These questions would drive the Orthodox response to Gnosticism and ultimately shape the development of Christian theology and institutions. The central myth of Valentinian Gnosticism, the fall of Sophia and the creation of the material world, deserves closer examination, for it represents a profound meditation on the problem of evil and the origins of suffering. The story begins in the Pleroma, the realm of fullness where the divine aeons exist in perfect harmony. These aeons are not separate gods but emanations or extensions of the one ineffable Father, paired complements that together constitute the totality of divine being. There are typically 30 eons arranged in 15 pairs, though different Gnostic texts give different numbers and names. Sophia, wisdom, is the youngest of the aeons, the last to emanate from the Father. Her name in Greek, Sophia, carries connotations not only of wisdom, but also of skill and craft, connecting her to the creative impulse within divinity itself. In some accounts, she is paired with theletos, will or desire, suggesting that she represents the divine desire to know and to create. But Sophia's desire becomes excessive. She attempts to comprehend the Father directly, without the mediation of her consort. Different texts describe her motivation differently. Some say she was overcome by love, others that she sought to imitate the Father by producing something from herself alone, still others that she acted in naive innocence, not understanding the danger of her action. Whatever her motive, the result was catastrophic. Because she acted alone without her complementary partner, her emanation was imperfect, formless, deficient, lacking the structure that comes from proper pairing within the divine economy. This abortional miscarriage of divine intent took on a kind of existence, but a degraded one, separated from the Pleroma. The Apocryphon of John, one of the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, describes the moment in vivid detail. And Sophia of the Epinoia, being an aeon, conceived a thought from herself and the conception of the invisible spirit and foreknowledge. She wanted to bring forth a likeness out of herself without the consent of the spirit he had not approved and without her consort. And because of the invincible power which is in her, her thought did not remain idle, and something came out of her which was imperfect and different from her appearance, because she had created it without her consort. This imperfect emanation was the demiurge, called Yaldabaoth in the Apocryphon of John, a name derived from Aramaic or Hebrew roots that might mean child of chaos, or begetter of Sebaoth. He inherited his mother's creative power, but lacked understanding of his true origin. Separated from the Pleroma, surrounded by darkness and void, he mistook his own realm for the totality of existence and himself for the supreme deity. He said, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." For he is ignorant of his strength, the place from which he had come, the Apocryphon recounts. This is a direct parody of the biblical God's self-declarations in Isaiah and elsewhere, what the Bible presents as the majestic assertion of monotheistic truth the Gnostics reinterpreted as the boast of an ignorant usurper. Yaldabaoth proceeded to create. From his own substance he generated the Archons, rulers or authorities who would serve as his subordinate powers. Different texts give different numbers, but most commonly there are 7 Archons corresponding to the 7 planets: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury and Moon. Each Archon has an animal face. Yaldabaoth himself is lion-faced or serpent-faced depending on the text, symbolizing their bestial nature and distance from true spirituality. Together, the Demiurge and his Archons crafted the material cosmos, modelling it unknowingly on patterns from the higher realm that they perceived only dimly. They created the stars and planets, the earth and its waters, and finally humanity. But in creating Adam, they made a fatal error from their perspective. They gave him more than they intended. The exact mechanism varies in different texts, but the basic pattern is consistent. While creating humanity, the Archons were tricked or compelled into transferring into Adam the divine spark that Sophia had unintentionally transmitted. In some versions, they see the image of the perfect human from the Pleroma reflected in the waters of matter, and try to capture this image by creating Adam. In others, Sophia or Christ tricks Yaldabaoth into breathing his own pneumatic substance into Adam. Either way, the result is that humanity contains something the Archons did not intend to give, a piece of the divine realm itself. When the Archons realized what they had done, they became jealous and afraid. They saw that the human they had created possessed something they lacked, the potential for true knowledge and reunion with the divine. So they trapped Adam in the material body, imposed forgetfulness through the multiple layers of cosmic powers, and established the system of fate and necessity that would keep humanity bound to the wheel of suffering. The story of Adam and Eve in Genesis is reinterpreted through this lens. The serpent in Eden becomes a hero rather than a villain, not Satan tempting humanity to sin, but Christ or Sophia in disguise, urging Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge against the jealous command of the Demiurge. Knowledge is not the source of the fall, but the means of liberation. The Demiurge's prohibition against eating the fruit is revealed as an attempt to keep humanity in ignorance of their true nature and origin. "What sort of a god is this?" asks the Testimony of Truth, another Nag Hammadi text. First he envied Adam that he should eat from the tree of knowledge, and secondly he said, "Adam, where are you?" And God does not have foreknowledge. That is, since he did not know this from the beginning. And afterwards he said, "Let us cast him out of this place, lest he eat of the tree of life and live forever." Surely he has shown himself to be a malicious envié. This radical rereading of Genesis struck at the heart of both Jewish and Christian identity. The God of the Hebrew Bible, whom Jews worshipped as the one true God and whom Christians identified with the Father of Jesus Christ, was reinterpreted as a false God, ignorant and malicious. The creation of the world, celebrated in Genesis as very good, was reframed as a cosmic imprisonment. The human condition was not the result of Adam and Eve's sin, but of the Demiurge's jealousy and fear. Yet the Gnostics did not see themselves as rejecting Judaism or Christianity, but as revealing their true meaning. The scriptures were not false but coded, written for those who could perceive their hidden significance. The God of the Old Testament was real, but he was not the ultimate God. Jesus was the true Saviour, but he had not come to redeem the material world, but to awaken souls to knowledge of the world beyond it. Sophia herself, the cause of the cosmic catastrophe, remained in a state of profound suffering, aware of her error, and longing to return to the Pleroma. Some texts describe her as split into two, a higher Sophia who remains in the divine realm, and a lower Sophia called Achamoth, who suffers in the material region. Her anguish permeates creation itself. The ignorance, passion, fear, and confusion that characterize material existence are not merely human experiences, but reflections of Sophia's own emotional states after her fall. Redemption in this system requires the restoration of Sophia as much as the salvation of individual souls. When humans awaken to gnosis, when the divine sparks remember their origin and begin their return to the pleroma, Sophia herself is gradually restored. The liberation of humanity and the redemption of wisdom are ultimately the same process. The healing of the primordial wound that brought the material cosmos into existence. This myth operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Cosmologically, it explained the structure of reality and the origin of evil. Psychologically, it mapped the inner experience of alienation, suffering, and awakening. Spiritually, it provided a framework for understanding salvation as remembering rather than redemption, as escape rather than transformation. And politically, it authorized resistance to all forms of domination by suggesting that the very structure of the cosmos was tyrannical and could be transcended. To understand how the Gnostics imagined the soul's imprisonment, we must examine their cosmology in more detail. This was not abstract speculation, but a practical map of the obstacles between humanity and salvation. Ancient astronomy, inherited from Babylonian stargazers and refined by Greek mathematicians, recognized 7 wandering stars or planets that moved against the backdrop of fixed stars. The Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These were not mere celestial objects, but powers that governed human life, dispensing fate and character according to their positions at the moment of birth. The Gnostics adopted this astronomical framework, but gave it a sinister interpretation. Each planet was ruled by an Archon, and together they formed a series of concentric spheres surrounding the Earth. A soul descending from the divine realm into incarnation had to pass through all 7 planetary spheres, and at each level, the ruling Archon imposed a limitation or defect. From Saturn, the outermost planet, came mortality and the fear of death. From Jupiter came the love of power and domination. Mars gave anger and violence. The Sun provided the illusion of sovereignty and self-importance. Venus contributed lust and bodily desire. Mercury gave greed and commercial cunning. The Moon, closest to Earth, gave the material body itself and the cycle of generation and decay. By the time the soul reached Earth, it was thoroughly enmeshed in these passions and limitations, wearing them like layers of clothing that obscured its true luminous nature. Birth was not a beginning, but a deeper stage of imprisonment. The body was not a temple, but a tomb. Soma Sema, the body is a grave, as some Platonists and Orphics had taught before the Gnostics. But the Archon's power extended beyond the moment of birth. They governed the entire structure of material existence, weaving the web of fate that determined the course of each life. Astrology, popular throughout the ancient world, was reinterpreted as the science of this cosmic tyranny. The movements of the planets were not benevolent cosmic harmonies, but the machinations of the Archons, manipulating human affairs according to their own inscrutable purposes. The Hermetic literature, which shared many themes with Gnosticism while retaining a more positive view of the cosmos, described the soul's descent through the spheres and the poimandres. And I saw in my mind that I had come to be in the 8th nature, possessing the power the nature had, and the nature rejoiced at my coming. And when I had become one with the 8th nature, I saw the natures of the 8th weeping. They were weeping at my departure and singing hymns, but I kept ascending, passing the spheres and their powers and weeping at their ignorance. For the Gnostics, these planetary spheres were not merely external cosmic regions, but also interior psychological states. The Archons were not only celestial rulers, but also inner demons, the passions, fears, and delusions that kept the soul captive to material existence. Anger, lust, greed, pride, fear, these were both cosmic forces imposed by the Archons and aspects of the false self that must be overcome. This psychological interpretation would have profound influence on later Christian spirituality, particularly in the Egyptian desert, where monks would reinterpret the battle against the Archons as spiritual warfare against their own thoughts and temptations. Evagrius Ponticus, a 4th century monk, would systematize 8 evil thoughts, later reduced to 7 deadly sins that besieged the soul, explicitly connecting them to the demons of Gnostic cosmology, even as he rejected Gnostic theology. But for the Gnostics, liberation required more than moral struggle. It required knowledge, specifically knowledge of the passwords and signs that would allow the soul to ascend back through the planetary spheres after death. Each Archon guarded his sphere, demanding tribute or recognition from passing souls. Those who lacked gnosis would be turned back, forced to reincarnate again and again, trapped in the cycle of birth and death. The texts preserved at Nag Hammadi include several apocalypses that describe this post-mortem ascent. The first apocalypse of James provides detailed instructions. When you depart, there will meet you the 3 powers, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. You shall say to them, followed by a complex formulae and passwords. The soul must know the secret names, must present the correct signs, must demonstrate possession of gnosis to pass each guardian. This was esoteric knowledge in the most literal sense, meant only for initiates, transmitted orally or in secret texts, jealously guarded. It paralleled other ancient mystery religions which also promised knowledge of the afterlife and power over the spirits that ruled it. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, the Isis cult from Egypt, the Mithraic mysteries from Persia, all offered initiates special knowledge and promised a blessed afterlife. But the Gnostic mysteries went further. They did not merely promise a better fate within the cosmic order, but escape from that order entirely. The goal was not to ascend to heaven, but to transcend heaven itself, to pass beyond the created cosmos altogether, and return to the pleroma, the realm of light that existed before and beyond all creation. The cosmos itself was a prison, an illusion, a trap. The beauty of the stars was a deception, masking the malevolent powers that used them as instruments of control. Natural law, the order that philosophers praised and that would become central to later Christian theology, was the iron necessity of fate imposed by the Archons. The very stability and predictability of the physical world, which others saw as evidence of divine wisdom, was for the Gnostics proof of cosmic tyranny. This radical devaluation of the material world had several important consequences. First, it implied a strong ethical dualism. The body and its desires were not merely temptations to be resisted, but aspects of the prison to be transcended. Some Gnostics responded with extreme asceticism, denying the flesh to free the spirit. Others took the opposite approach. Since the material world and its laws were created by the false god, they had no ultimate validity, and the spiritual person was free to transgress them without guilt. Second, it meant that the goal of spiritual life was not transformation of the world, but escape from it. Unlike Orthodox Christianity, which looked forward to the resurrection of the body and the renewal of creation, Gnosticism sought the dissolution of matter and the return of all pneumatic souls to the pleroma. Creation would not be redeemed but unmade. Third, it created a profound divide between those who possessed gnosis and those who did not. The pneumatics, those with the divine spark, were fundamentally different from the psychics and hylics. This was not a matter of moral virtue or religious devotion, but of essential nature. Some had the spark of divine light, others did not. This inherent elitism troubled critics ancient and modern, though Gnostics argued that the spark was activated by grace and revelation, not by human effort or merit. The cosmology also incorporated elements from multiple religious traditions. The 7 Archons corresponded to the 7 planets of Babylonian astronomy. The idea of ascending through heavenly spheres appeared in Jewish apocalyptic literature and early Jewish mysticism. The concept of fate or Heimamen came from Hellenistic astrology and Stoic philosophy. The dualism of light and darkness recalled Persian Zoroastrianism, though Gnostic dualism was ultimately not between 2 equal principles, but between the true God and a lesser, ignorant creator. This syncretic character was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed Gnosticism to speak to people from diverse backgrounds, weaving together threads from all the major traditions of the ancient Mediterranean world. But it also made Gnostic systems appear convoluted and bizarre to outsiders, and it left them vulnerable to charges of incoherence and eclecticism. The prison metaphor itself operated at multiple levels. Literally, the cosmos was a prison created by the Archons to trap divine sparks. Psychologically, the prison was ignorance, the amnesia that prevented the soul from remembering its true origin. Socially, the prison was the structures of worldly power, the empires and institutions that claimed authority over human lives. Existentially, the prison was embodiment itself, the experience of being trapped in matter, subject to suffering, change and death. To awaken from this prison required a call from beyond it. The soul could not save itself through effort or virtue. It needed to hear a voice from outside the system, a message from the realm of light that would pierce through the layers of cosmic deception and inner amnesia. This is why the Gnostics emphasize revelation over reason, gnosis over philosophy. Knowledge of the divine could not be deduced from observation of the material world, which was, after all, a false creation, but only revealed directly from the transcendent realm. This revelation came through a divine messenger, a revealer figure who descended from the pleroma, passed through the spheres of the Archons in disguise, and entered the material world to awaken those who had the capacity to hear. In Christian Gnosticism, this revealer was Jesus, not the earthly human who died on the cross, but the divine, Christ who only appeared to be human, who taught the secret knowledge to his inner circle, and who showed the way of ascent back to the Father. The doctrine of Christ's apparent humanity, docetism, from the Greek dokein, to seem, followed logically from Gnostic principles. If matter was evil or at least inferior, the divine could not truly unite with it. Jesus' body was therefore a kind of illusion, or temporary vehicle, not a real human body subject to suffering and death. This view was vehemently rejected by Orthodox Christians, who insisted on the full reality of Christ's incarnation and crucifixion. That which has not been assumed has not been healed, Gregory of Nazianzus would later argue. If Christ did not truly become human, his death could not truly redeem humanity. But for the Gnostics, redemption did not require Christ's physical death, but his revelation. He came not to die for sins, but to impart knowledge, to speak the words that would wake the sleeping soul. His crucifixion, if it happened at all, was a cosmic joke. The Archons thought they were killing the revealer, not realizing they were destroying only the material appearance, while the divine spirit remained untouched. This prison cosmology has exercised a strange fascination on Western imagination ever since. It resonates with experiences of alienation, oppression, and existential dislocation. It speaks to anyone who has felt that the world is fundamentally wrong, that they don't belong here, that life is a kind of exile from an unknown home. And it offers a powerful critique of all forms of domination by suggesting that authority itself, up to and including the creator of the universe, can be questioned and ultimately transcended. If the cosmos was a prison, the divine spark within humanity was the key to escape. But first it had to be recognized and awakened. This was the essential task of Gnostic spirituality, to remember who you truly were beneath the layers of material existence. The Gospel of Thomas, probably the most famous of the Nag Hammadi texts, begins with the promise, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." The text consists of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many of them paralleling sayings found in the canonical Gospels but others distinctly Gnostic in flavour. Throughout, the emphasis is on seeking, finding and knowing. If those who lead you say to you, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you, Jesus says in saying 3. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. This imperative to self-knowledge echoes the famous Delphic maxim, "Know thyself," but with a distinctive twist. What you must know about yourself is not your character or your place in society, but your origin in the divine realm. Self-knowledge is knowledge of the divine spark, recognition of the stranger within, the pneumatic essence that does not belong to this world. The Gospel of Truth, possibly written by Valentinus himself, describes the human condition as a kind of cosmic nightmare. So it was with all who lacked knowledge of the Father. Not seeing him, they experienced fear and confusion. This confusion solidified like a fog so that no one could see. Therefore error became strong. She worked on her material substance vainly, because she did not know truth. She prepared something with great power and beauty as a substitute for the truth. This caused the disciples no sorrow, since it had the form of truth. Thus error was angry with those who knew of this. This is why error persecuted them. They were restricted by her and had no freedom of speech. Error, personified as a female power in parallel to truth, creates the material world as a beautiful deception, a substitute reality that traps those who mistake it for truth. Those who see through the illusion face persecution because they threaten the stability of the cosmic lie. This is why knowledge is dangerous and must be kept secret, not from some arbitrary elitism, but because the powers that rule this world will attack anyone who challenges their sovereignty. The awakening to gnosis was described as a dramatic transformation. The treatise on the resurrection speaks of it as already happening. Do not think the resurrection is an illusion. It is no illusion, but it is truth. Indeed, it is more fitting to say that the world is an illusion, rather than the resurrection. For the Gnostic, resurrection was not a future event after physical death, but a present spiritual reality, the raising of the soul from the death of ignorance to the life of knowledge. This raised the question of ritual and practice. How did one cultivate gnosis? How did the spark become activated? The evidence suggests diverse practices across different Gnostic communities. Some emphasized asceticism, fasting, sexual abstinence, withdrawal from worldly affairs, to free the spirit from material attachments. The testimony of truth praises those who have not known desire, nor have they begotten in the flesh, but with virginity have they begotten themselves. They will be victorious over death. Others practiced forms of visionary mysticism, seeking direct experiences of the divine realm through meditation, prayer, and ecstatic techniques. The Apocalypse of Paul describes a heavenly ascent in which the apostle passes through the spheres, encountering the Archons and finally reaching the 10th heaven, where he sees his fellow spirits. Ritual baptism played an important role in many Gnostic communities, but with a meaning different from Orthodox Christian baptism. It was not primarily about washing away sin, but about imparting gnosis, sealing the initiate with protective knowledge for the soul's eventual ascent. The Gospel of Philip distinguishes between the baptism of water, which Orthodox Christians practiced, and the baptism of fire and the Holy Spirit, which the Gnostics claimed to possess. Truth does not come into the world naked, but it comes in types and images. One will not receive truth in any other way. The sacramental meal took on similarly esoteric meaning. In the Gospel of Philip, the Eucharist is described as consuming the perfect human. Jesus came crucifying the world. The exact meaning is obscure, but it seems to suggest a reversal. Not that Christ feeds believers with his body and blood, but that the enlightened consume or transcend the cosmic powers that crucified the revealer. Sexual symbolism pervaded Gnostic texts, sometimes literally describing sacred sexual practices, as in some Valentinian rituals where the bridal chamber represented mystical union with one's divine counterpart, and sometimes using erotic imagery metaphorically to describe the soul's reunion with the divine. The Gospel of Philip speaks extensively about marriage and the bridal chamber as sacred mysteries. The mysteries of truth are revealed as types and images. Great is the mystery of marriage, for without it the world would not exist. Women played prominent roles in these communities, which troubled Orthodox critics. Irenaeus complained that the Valentinians allowed women to prophesy, teach, and perform sacraments. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as the recipient of secret teachings that the male disciples did not receive, leading to conflict. Peter said to Mary, "Sister, we know that the Saviour loved you more than the rest of women. Tell us the words of the Saviour which you remember, which you know but we do not." Mary answered and said, "What is hidden from you, I will proclaim to you." When Mary shares her vision, Andrew and Peter reject it. Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge and not openly? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? But Levi defends her. "Peter, you've always been hot-tempered. If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Saviour knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us." This controversy reflects real tensions in early Christianity about authority, revelation, and gender. The Gnostics' willingness to honour female teachers and to use feminine imagery for the divine, Sophia, the Holy Spirit as feminine, contrasted sharply with the increasingly patriarchal structure of the Orthodox Church. The spark itself was described in various ways. Sometimes it was called pneuma, spirit, sometimes psyche, soul, sometimes nous, mind or intellect, sometimes sperma, seed. The metaphors varied, but the essential idea remained constant. Within certain humans existed something that did not belong to the material world, a fragment of transcendence trapped in matter like a hostage awaiting rescue. This spark was both utterly alien to the material world and simultaneously the truest part of the human person. It was who you really were beneath all the layers of social identity, psychological conditioning, and bodily existence. To know the spark was to know yourself as fundamentally other, a stranger in a strange land, an exile longing for home, a prisoner dreaming of freedom. The Gnostic emphasis on the divine spark had radical implications for human dignity and equality. If the spark transcended all material differences, race, class, gender, education, status, then those who possessed it were fundamentally equal regardless of worldly circumstances. A slave could be pneumatic while an emperor might be merely hylic. A woman could be a teacher while learned men might dwell in ignorance. This levelling of worldly hierarchies was deeply subversive in a highly stratified society. Yet the flip side was equally troubling. The division of humanity into pneumatics, psychics, and hylics created a new hierarchy based on spiritual nature rather than social status. If the capacity for gnosis was innate rather than achieved, then most of humanity was permanently excluded from salvation through no fault of their own. This predestinarian element in Gnostic thought troubled critics then and now, though some Gnostics argued that the spark could be present but dormant, requiring only the call of revelation to awaken it. The experience of gnosis itself was described as both terrifying and liberating. It meant realizing that everything you thought was real, your body, your relationships, your world, was ultimately unreal, a shadow play projected on the walls of the cosmic prison. It meant confronting the horror of your situation. You were a divine being trapped in flesh, ruled by ignorant and malicious powers, caught in a system designed to keep you enslaved through endless cycles of birth and death. But it also meant hope. If your true self was not the suffering material person, but the eternal divine spark, then you were already, essentially, free. The prison could be transcended. Death was not the end, but opportunity, if you possessed the right knowledge, to escape back to your true home. The sufferings of this world were temporary and ultimately unreal. They cannot touch the inner spiritual person, as Heracleon, another Valentinian teacher, reportedly said. This combination of cosmic pessimism and spiritual optimism gave Gnosticism its distinctive emotional tone. The material world was utterly fallen, irredeemable, a mistake, but the pneumatic self was utterly transcendent, invulnerable, destined to return to the light. The task was simply to remember who you were, to refuse the false reality offered by the Archons, and to await or actively seek the moment of escape. the diversity and creativity of Gnostic thought, which its practitioners saw as spiritual vitality, looked like dangerous chaos to those trying to build a unified Christian church. As Gnosticism spread through the empire in the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, Orthodox Christian leaders mounted an increasingly systematic campaign to define, refute, and ultimately suppress it. The earliest Christian writings show little concern with Gnosticism as such. The letters of Paul, written in the 50s and 60s CE, combat various errors, but none that are clearly Gnostic in the technical sense. The pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, probably written somewhat later, warn against what is falsely called knowledge, gnosis, and myths and endless genealogies, possibly referring to Gnostic cosmological speculations, but remain vague about specifics. By the mid-2nd century, however, Gnostic teachers were prominent in major Christian centres: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch. They claimed apostolic authority, possessed their own scriptures, gathered communities, and offered a sophisticated theological framework that appealed to educated converts. From the Orthodox perspective, they threatened to pull Christianity in the direction of Hellenistic philosophy and away from its Jewish roots, to replace faith with speculation, and to substitute elite knowledge for Catholic universal teaching. The response came in several forms. First, Orthodox teachers began to define more precisely what constituted authentic Christian teaching. They appealed to 3 standards: scripture, tradition, and apostolic succession. Christians should follow the scriptures recognized by the churches, though the exact canon was still being debated, the rule of faith handed down publicly from the apostles, not secret teachings, and the bishops who stood in direct line of succession from the apostles. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon in Gaul, modern France, wrote the most influential anti-Gnostic work around 180 CE, Against Heresies, full title, On the Detection and Overthrow of the So-Called Gnosis. In 5 lengthy books, he systematically described and refuted various Gnostic systems, particularly Valentinianism. Irenaeus began by exposing what he saw as the absurdity and inconsistency of Gnostic cosmologies. He detailed the complex mythologies with obvious contempt. Such then is the account which they give of what took place within the Pleroma, such the calamities that flowed from the passion which seized upon the aeon called Sophia. He mocked the multiplication of divine beings. Some of them assert that there is one original bythus, depth, then siege, silence, and then these produce all things according to conjunction. Beyond ridicule, Irenaeus offered substantive theological arguments. He insisted on the identity of the Creator and the Father of Jesus Christ. They were the same God, not different beings. He defended the goodness of creation and the body, arguing that God made the material world and pronounced it good, and that Christ truly became human to redeem humanity. He emphasized the public nature of Christian teaching the apostles had preached openly, not communicated secrets to elite initiates. Most importantly, Irenaeus argued for a unified church with recognized authorities and agreed upon teachings. The church, though dispersed throughout the whole world, carefully preserves the apostolic tradition, as if occupying but one house. She believes these things everywhere alike, as if she had but one heart and one soul, and preaches them harmoniously, and teaches them, and hands them down, as if she possessed but one mouth. This vision of Catholicity, universal agreement on essential teachings, was both descriptive and prescriptive. Irenaeus was not merely observing unity but trying to create it, drawing sharp boundaries between authentic Christianity and heretical deviation. Those who disagreed with his standards were not simply mistaken but dangerous, agents of Satan, introducing destructive heresies. Tertullian, writing in Carthage in North Africa around 200 CE, took an even more aggressive approach. In his prescription against heretics, he argued that heretics had no right to even debate scripture with Orthodox Christians. They were trespassers using documents that didn't belong to them. I say that our scriptures are indeed older, and therefore prior and original, and that the heretics have stolen from them and adapted to their own uses. Tertullian also attacked Gnostic methods. They interpreted scripture allegorically, finding hidden meanings everywhere, making texts say whatever they wanted. They changed their teachings constantly, with every teacher proposing new systems. They ordained people without proper authority. They allowed women to teach and baptize. The very women of these heretics, how wanton they are, for they are bold enough to teach, to dispute, to enact exorcisms, to undertake cures, it may be even to baptize. Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the early 3rd century, produced another massive refutation, the refutation of all heresies. His strategy was to expose Gnostic teachings as derivative from pagan philosophy rather than Christian revelation. The Valentinians got their ideas from Plato and Pythagoras, Basilides from Aristotle, the Nasines from the mystery religions. This was guilt by association, showing that Gnostic claims to apostolic tradition were false, that their systems originated in human speculation rather than divine revelation. But polemic was not enough. The Orthodox Church also took institutional measures. Bishops who taught Gnostic ideas were removed or condemned. Marcion, a wealthy shipowner from Syenope in Asia Minor, came to Rome around 140 CE and proposed a form of Christianity that rejected the Hebrew Scriptures entirely, seeing the God of the Old Testament as inferior to the Father of Jesus. The Roman Church excommunicated him in 144. Valentinus himself, despite his learning and orthodoxy on many points, was repeatedly refused the position of bishop. The formation of a recognized scriptural canon was partly a response to Gnostic proliferation of texts. Marcion had created his own canon consisting only of Luke's Gospel and 10 Pauline letters, all edited to remove Jewish elements. The Valentinians wrote or revised numerous Gospels, apocalypses, and epistles. In response, Orthodox churches began to define more precisely which books were genuinely apostolic and authoritative. By the late 2nd century, a core canon was emerging. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Acts of the Apostles, Paul's letters, and other apostolic writings. The Muratorian fragment, a list probably dating from late 2nd century Rome, includes most of the books that would eventually be in the New Testament and explicitly excludes others. The letter to the Laodiceans and another to the Alexandrians, both forged in Paul's name for the sect of Marcion, and several others which cannot be received in the Catholic Church, for it is not fitting that gall be mixed with honey. The development of creeds also served to define Orthodox belief. The Apostles' Creed, in its earliest form, affirmed belief in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, directly contra-Gnostic in asserting the Creator's identity with the Supreme God. It confessed Christ, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead and buried, affirming the reality of incarnation against dotatism. And it looked forward to the resurrection of the body, denying Gnostic devaluation of the flesh. These creedal affirmations became baptismal confessions. To join the Church, one had to publicly affirm these beliefs, effectively excluding Gnostic interpretations. The ritualization of orthodoxy created a clear line between those inside and outside the community. Despite these measures, Gnosticism continued to spread. In Egypt, it seems to have been particularly strong. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200, engaged with Gnostic ideas at length, sometimes adopting their language while rejecting their conclusions. His student Origen, one of the greatest theologians of the early Church, showed clear influence from Valentinian thought even as he opposed Valentinian theology. The final blow came not from theological argument but from political power. When Constantine converted to Christianity in 312 CE and subsequently made Christianity the favoured religion of the empire, Orthodox Christianity gained access to imperial enforcement. What had been theological disputes became matters of law, what had been excommunication became criminal prosecution. The Council of Nicaea in 325, convened by Constantine to settle the Arian controversy, a different dispute about Christ's nature, represented a new model, the emperor summoning bishops, providing transportation and lodging, and enforcing whatever conclusions they reached. Though Gnosticism was not the main topic at Nicaea, the precedent was clear. The empire would enforce Christian orthodoxy and dissent would be suppressed. Subsequent councils and imperial decrees condemned various heresies. Books were ordered burned. Heretical teachers were exiled or worse. The Theodosian Code, compiled in 438, included numerous laws against heretics. All places where such persons gather for their deplorable madness, if they are proved to belong to the said persons, shall be confiscated to the resources of our fisc. We command that they shall be expelled from the very walls of their cities, so that the Catholic churches throughout the world shall be left to the Catholic bishops who hold the faith of Nicaea. In Egypt, the destruction was particularly thorough. The great Serapeum of Alexandria, a centre of pagan learning that had also harboured Gnostic and Hermetic texts, was destroyed by Christian mobs in 391. Temples were converted to churches, libraries were satirred or burned. The Pachomian monastery at Parbau, where some of the Nag Hammadi codices were probably copied, came under pressure to conform to Nicene orthodoxy. Sometime around 390 CE, someone, perhaps a monk, perhaps a scribe, gathered 13 codices containing Gnostic and related texts, sealed them in a large jar, and buried them beneath a cliff near Chenoboskion, ancient name for the Nag Hammadi region. Whether they were hiding them from destruction or burying them because they had been declared heretical, and the monastery needed to dispose of them, we cannot know. But the result was that these texts, which would otherwise have been lost, survived intact for 16 centuries. By the 5th century, Gnosticism as an organised movement was effectively extinct within the Roman Empire. Its teachers were dead, scattered, or silent. Its books were burned or hidden. Its communities were disbanded or driven underground. Orthodox Christianity, allied with imperial power, had won, but Gnostic ideas did not entirely disappear. They would resurface, transformed and adapted in later centuries, carried forward by movements that preserved fragments of the ancient gnosis, even as they developed their own distinctive teachings. The rise of Christian orthodoxy in the 4th and 5th centuries represented, from a Gnostic perspective, precisely what their myth had predicted: the triumph of the demiurge and his archons, the consolidation of cosmic tyranny under the guise of divine authority. The church that emerged from this period bore little resemblance to the diverse, spirit-led communities of the 1st century or the intellectually vibrant, questioning schools of the 2nd. Constantine's conversion changed everything. Before 312, Christianity was a minority religion, periodically persecuted, unable to build openly, dependent on the goodwill or indifference of local authorities. After Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge, which he attributed to the Christian god, Christianity became the emperor's religion. Imperial patronage brought wealth, prestige, and power, and also imperial control. Constantine built churches across the empire, including the Great Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He exempted clergy from taxes and civil obligations. He made Sunday a public holiday. He gave bishops judicial authority. But he also expected obedience. When theological disputes threatened Christian unity, he intervened, summoning councils and enforcing their decisions. The Council of Nicaea in 325 addressed the Arian controversy, whether Christ was of the same substance, homoousios, as the Father, or merely similar, homoousios. The difference of a single Greek letter contained profound theological implications. Arius, a presbyter from Alexandria, argued that Christ was created by the Father and therefore subordinate, not co-eternal. Athanasius and his allies insisted on Christ's full divinity and equality with the Father. The council sided with Athanasius, producing the Nicene Creed. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten of his Father, of the substance of the Father, God of God, light of light, true God, begotten not made, of one substance with the Father. The theological sophistication was remarkable, but so was the method of resolution. The emperor had gathered bishops from across the empire, housed and fed them, presided over debates, and then enforced the majority decision. Those who refused to sign the creed, including Arius, were exiled. Unity was achieved through imperial coercion. This pattern would repeat. The Council of Constantinople in 381 refined the Nicene formulation and addressed the status of the Holy Spirit. The Council of Ephesus in 431 condemned Nestorianism, which separated Christ's divine and human natures too sharply, and affirmed Mary as Theotokos, God-bearer. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 defined Christ as one person in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. Each council drew sharper boundaries, defined orthodoxy more precisely, and condemned more heresies. The Church was becoming what Irenaeus had envisioned, a unified institution with clear teachings, recognized authorities, and the power to enforce conformity. But this required suppressing the diversity that had characterized early Christianity, including and especially Gnostic alternatives. The transformation was not only theological but also institutional. The Church developed a hierarchical structure mirroring the empire itself. At the local level were presbyters, priests, serving congregations. Above them were bishops governing cities and their surrounding territories. In major centres, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, patriarchs exercised authority over entire regions. Councils of bishops made decisions for the whole church, subject to confirmation by the emperor. Women who had served as deacons, prophets, and teachers in the earliest communities were increasingly excluded from ministry. The pastoral epistles' injunctions against women teaching were now enforced universally. The Gnostic practice of honouring female teachers and using feminine divine imagery was cited as evidence of heresy. Orthodoxy was masculine, patriarchal, hierarchical. Monasticism arose as a protest against this institutionalization, or perhaps as a way to preserve something of the earlier radical spirit within the new imperial church. Beginning in Egypt in the late 3rd century, men and women withdrew to the desert to pursue lives of prayer, asceticism, and spiritual combat. They rejected wealth, power, and worldly success, the very things the church was now acquiring. The early monks were often barely literate, suspicious of theological speculation, focused on practical struggle against temptation and demons. Yet in their psychology of spiritual warfare, echoes of Gnostic cosmology persisted. Evagrius Ponticus, who lived as a monk in Egypt from 383 until his death around 399, systematized the monastic understanding of inner demons, 8 evil thoughts, logismoi, that besiege the soul: gluttony, lust, greed, sadness, anger, listlessness, vainglory, and pride. These were not merely moral failings, but spiritual powers, demons that attack the mind. Evagrius's language often sounded Gnostic. The intellect that fights against the demon of avarice is like a naked person sparring with a bear. The demon takes hold of that which the intellect has not cut off and hurls it to the ground. He spoke of ascending through knowledge to the vision of God, of the intellect as imprisoned in matter, of the need to transcend material existence. Yet Evagrius rejected Gnostic theology. He affirmed that the Creator and the Father were one, that matter was not evil, that salvation came through Christ's incarnation. He had taken the Gnostic map of inner experience, the sense of being besieged by hostile powers, the need for knowledge and vigilance, the goal of transcending material existence, and translated it into orthodox Christian terms. The battle against the Archons became the battle against demons and passions. This psychological internalization of Gnostic cosmology would profoundly influence Christian spirituality. The inner life became a battleground. Temptations were demonic attacks. Progress meant ascending through stages of purification and illumination to ultimate union with God. The monks were, in a sense, living out the Gnostic journey of the soul through the planetary spheres, but now within an orthodox framework that affirmed rather than rejected the goodness of creation. Meanwhile, the physical destruction of heretical texts continued. In 367, Athanasius, now Bishop of Alexandria, issued an Easter letter listing the books that should be read in churches, essentially the New Testament canon as we know it, and condemning apocryphal books to which they affix names of the saints and use them as a cloak for their wicked practices. He called on monks to purge their libraries of such texts. This may have prompted the burial of the Nag Hammadi codices. Pachomian monasteries in the region were trying to maintain orthodox respectability. Possessing heretical books could bring serious consequences. Better to hide them than burn them, perhaps with some hope that they might be recovered when times changed. But times did not change, at least not in a way favourable to Gnosticism. Theodosius V, emperor from 379 to 395, made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire and initiated systematic suppression of both paganism and heresy. In 380, his Edict of Thessalonica declared, "It is our desire that all the various nations which are subject to our clemency and moderation should continue in the profession of that religion which was delivered to the Romans by the divine Apostle Peter. We authorize the followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians. But as for the others, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics." Imperial law now defined religious truth. The Theodosian Code, compiled in 438, contained numerous provisions against heretics. They were barred from public office, forbidden to assemble, their property confiscated, their teachings banned. The code even prescribed punishment for those who merely attended heretical services. If any person shall attend the conventicles of heretics, he shall be fined £10 of gold. Paganism faced even harsher treatment. The Serapeum, Alexandria's great temple, was destroyed in 391. The famous philosopher Hypatia, who taught Neoplatonism and mathematics, was murdered by a Christian mob in 415, her body torn apart with tiles or oyster shells. Pagan temples across the empire were closed, demolished, or converted to churches. The world of religious diversity and philosophical debate that had nurtured Gnosticism was being systematically destroyed. In its place arose Christendom, a Christian civilization where church and empire were allied, where orthodoxy was enforced by law, where dissent meant not just excommunication but criminal prosecution. From a Gnostic perspective, this could only confirm their darkest insights. The material world was indeed ruled by tyrannical powers who suppressed truth and persecuted those who possessed gnosis. The demiurge had allied with Caesar. The Archons had infiltrated the church. The cosmic prison had found new jailers. Yet even in defeat, Gnostic ideas showed remarkable resilience. They did not disappear but went underground, adapting and evolving, reappearing in forms that would perplex and trouble the church for centuries to come. The desert fathers and mothers who fled the cities for lives of radical asceticism in the Egyptian wilderness preserved and transformed elements of Gnostic thought even as they rejected Gnostic theology. Their experiences of spiritual combat, their maps of the soul's journey, and their emphasis on direct knowledge of God all echoed themes from the forbidden teachings. The movement began with Anthony, born around 251 in Middle Egypt. According to his biographer Athanasius, Anthony heard the gospel command, "If you would be perfect, go, sell what you possess and give to the poor," and took it literally. He gave away his property and withdrew to the desert, living in increasingly remote places, battling demons, praying constantly, eating little, seeking union with God. Athanasius's Life of Anthony, written around 360, became enormously influential, inspiring thousands to embrace monastic life. But the text reveals fascinating continuities with Gnostic thought. Anthony's demons are not merely metaphors for temptation, but real spiritual powers who attack him physically and mentally. They appear in various forms, as a woman to tempt him with lust, as wild beasts to terrify him, as philosophical arguments to confuse him. The demons kept watch by night, Athanasius wrote. They approached from the four walls, seeming to enter through them, changing themselves into the forms of beasts and reptiles. And straightway the place was filled with the appearances of lions, bears, leopards, bulls, serpents, asps, scorpions, and wolves. These are precisely the animal-faced archons of Gnostic cosmology, now reimagined as demons assaulting a Christian monk. Anthony's response was not intellectual argument but spiritual warfare. Prayer, scripture, the sign of the cross. Yet his goal was remarkably similar to the Gnostic aim, to transcend the material realm and achieve direct knowledge of God. When he prayed, he asked not to be protected from demons, but he asked to see them in order that he might make light of them, Athanasius reported. This direct confrontation with spiritual powers, this refusal to fear them, echoes the Gnostic pneumatic's confidence in the essential invulnerability of the divine spark. Evagrius Ponticus developed this psychology of spiritual combat into a sophisticated system. Born around 345 to a Christian family in Pontus, modern Turkey, Evagrius was educated, ordained, and served in Constantinople before a romantic entanglement led him to flee to Egypt. There he joined the monastic community and spent the rest of his life, until around 300, in the desert writing about the spiritual life. Evagrius's works read like Gnostic texts translated into orthodox vocabulary. He wrote of the nous, intellect or mind, as the highest part of the human person, naturally oriented toward God but now trapped in matter and besieged by demons. He described 8 evil thoughts, later reduced by Gregory the Great to 7 deadly sins, that attack the soul, each associated with a demon that must be resisted through specific practices. His practikos laid out stages of spiritual progress, from praktike, the active life of combating passions, to theoretic physic, contemplation of nature, to theologic, contemplation of God. This 3-stage ascent parallels the Gnostic journey through the planetary spheres to the pleroma. The goal was apatheia, not apathy in the modern sense, but freedom from destructive passions, a state of inner tranquility that allowed pure contemplation of God. In his more speculative works, Evagrius went even further. He taught that intellects, noes, originally existed in perfect unity with God but fell into matter through some primordial movement or cooling of love. The material world exists as a kind of hospital or school for these fallen intellects. Through spiritual practice and divine grace, the intellect could purify itself and return to unity with God, a process that might extend even beyond this life, with the possibility that all rational creatures, including demons, might eventually be restored. This doctrine of apokatastasis, universal restoration, was controversial and would be condemned at the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 503. Yet it preserved in Christian form something of the Gnostic vision, the idea that the material world was a fall from a higher state and that the goal was return to that original unity. Evagrius had internalized the Gnostic myth, making Sophia's fall and return a pattern for every soul's journey. The sayings of the Desert Fathers, collected from the 4th and 5th centuries, record the wisdom of these hermits in brief, often paradoxical aphorisms. Many deal with the spiritual combat. Abba Antony said, "I saw the snares that the enemy spreads out over the world, and I said, groaning, 'What can get through from such snares?' Then I heard a voice saying to me, 'Humility. The stairs are the Archon's web of fate.' And humility, recognizing one's dependence on God rather than one's own power, is the way through. Other sayings emphasize direct experience over learning. Abba Arsenius asked an old Egyptian monk about his thoughts. Someone noticed this and said to him, 'Abba Arsenius, how is it that you, with such a good Latin and Greek education, ask this peasant about your thoughts?' He replied, 'I have indeed been taught Latin and Greek, but I do not know even the alphabet of this peasant.' This privileging of experiential knowledge over formal education echoes the Gnostic distinction between mere learning and true gnosis. Women participated in the desert movement, though their stories are less well preserved. Amasincletica, Amasera, and others lived as hermits, or in small communities, taught disciples and battled demons. The sayings of the desert mothers show women claiming the same spiritual authority as men. Amasincletica said, "There are many who live in the mountains and behave as if they were in the town, and they are wasting their time. It is possible to be a solitary in one's mind while living in a crowd, and it is possible for one who is a solitary to live in the crowd of his own thoughts." The monastic movement spread from Egypt throughout the Christian world. Basil of Caesarea organized communal monasteries in Cappadocia. John Cassian brought Egyptian monastic practices to the West, establishing monasteries in Marseille and writing the institutes and conferences that would shape Western monasticism. Benedict of Nursia founded Monte Cassino and wrote the rule that would govern most Western monasteries for centuries. Each of these developments drew on the desert tradition, which in turn had absorbed and transformed elements of Gnostic spirituality. The sense of cosmic spiritual warfare, the stages of ascent toward God, the goal of transcending material attachments, the emphasis on inner transformation rather than external observance. All these echoed themes that the Gnostics had articulated, but that now found expression within Orthodox Christianity. The desert monks had accomplished something remarkable. They had preserved the experiential core of Gnosticism, the sense of being strangers in a hostile world, the battle against inner and outer powers, the journey toward transcendence, while rejecting its cosmological dualism. They affirmed that the Creator and the Father were one, that matter was good, that the body would be resurrected. But they lived as if they were Gnostic pneumatics, treating the material world as an obstacle to be overcome and seeking direct knowledge of the divine. This tension between Orthodox theology and quasi-Gnostic spirituality would continue to characterize Christian mysticism. Mystics would repeatedly discover through their own experience truths that sounded dangerously Gnostic, that the soul was trapped in matter, that it must ascend through stages to reach God, that ordinary religious observance was insufficient without direct knowledge of the divine. And repeatedly the Church would struggle to distinguish between legitimate mysticism and heretical gnosis. The line between them was often thin. Both emphasized inner experience over external authority, direct knowledge over mere faith, transformation of consciousness over moral behavior alone. The difference lay not in experience but in interpretation. Whether one understood the journey as return to the one God who created all things, or as escape from a false creator to a higher deity. In the desert, this distinction remained mostly theoretical. The monks were too busy battling demons, praying through the night, and seeking God to worry much about cosmological speculation. They had taken the Gnostic pattern and baptized it, creating a Christian spirituality that could speak to the human experience of alienation and longing, without rejecting the goodness of creation or the identity of Creator and Redeemer. Though Gnosticism as an organized movement was crushed by the 5th century, its ideas proved remarkably resilient, reappearing throughout Christian history in new forms. 3 movements particularly carried forward Gnostic themes: Manichaeism, which spread across Asia, the Bogomils in the Balkans, and the Cathars in Western Europe. Each adapted Gnostic dualism to their own context, and each faced violent suppression by the Church. Manichaeism was founded by Mani, 216 to 274 CE, a Persian prophet who claimed to be the final successor to Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus. Mani's teaching was explicitly dualistic. 2 eternal principles, light and darkness, were locked in cosmic warfare. The material world resulted from the mixture of these 2 principles when forces of darkness invaded the realm of light and captured particles of divine light, which became imprisoned in matter. The mythology was elaborate. The Father of Greatness sent forth various emanations, the Mother of Life, the primal man, to combat the powers of darkness. Though initially defeated, these divine figures gradually developed a strategy to liberate the imprisoned light particles. The sun and moon served as cosmic vessels gathering up the light. The prophets taught humans how to release the light through ascetic practices. Eventually, all light would be extracted from matter, and the cosmos would be destroyed. Humans contained both light from the divine realm and darkness from their material bodies. Salvation meant recognizing this truth and living in a way that released the light. Through vegetarianism, plants contained less trapped light than animals. Sexual abstinence to avoid creating more prisons for light particles, and adherence to strict moral codes. The Manichaean community divided into two classes: the elect, who followed the full ascetic discipline, and the hearers, who supported the elect and hoped for better rebirth. This two-tiered structure paralleled the Gnostic distinction between pneumatics and psychics. Mani himself wrote prolifically, creating his own scriptures in multiple languages. Unlike the Gnostics, whose texts were scattered fragments, Manichaeism had a founder, a canon, an organized church structure, and a missionary zeal. It spread rapidly east into Central Asia and China, where it survived until the 14th century, and west into the Roman Empire. Augustine of Hippo, before his conversion to Christianity, was a Manichaean hearer for 9 years, 373-382 CE. His Confessions describes his attraction to Manichaeism. It seemed to solve the problem of evil by attributing it to an independent principle of darkness rather than to the good God, and his eventual disillusionment. Manichaean cosmology was too crude, its interpretation of scripture too literal, its promises of gnosis unfulfilled. After Augustine became a Christian and then a bishop, he wrote extensively against Manichaeism, using his insider knowledge to devastating effect. He emphasized that evil was not a substance but a privation, the absence of good, and therefore did not require positing an evil principle opposed to God. He defended the goodness of creation and the body. He insisted that free will, not cosmic dualism, explained human sin. Despite, or perhaps because of such refutations, Manichaeism persisted in the West until the 6th century, and in the East much longer. Imperial laws condemned it harshly. The Theodosian Code prescribed death for Manichaean elect and confiscation of property for hearers. Yet communities survived, often in secret, preserving their texts and practices. The Bogomils emerged in 10th century Bulgaria, taking their name from a priest named Bogomil, meaning a beloved of God. They taught a dualistic cosmology similar to Gnosticism. The material world was created by Satanael, a fallen angel or rebellious son of God, who trapped divine souls in human bodies. Jesus was a purely spiritual being sent to reveal the way of escape. The Old Testament described the acts of the false creator, while the New Testament revealed the true God. Bogomils rejected the entire institutional church, its hierarchy, sacraments, buildings, and wealth. They saw the cross as the instrument of Christ's torture, not an object of veneration. They refused to pray in churches, which they considered temples of the demiurge. They practiced severe asceticism, avoided meat and wine, renounced marriage and property. The movement spread from Bulgaria into the Byzantine Empire and northward into Russia. Byzantine authorities responded with persecution, imprisonment, exile, burnings. The Emperor Alexios II Komnenos ruled 1081 to 1118, interrogated Bogomil leaders personally, and had several burned alive in the Hippodrome in Constantinople. Yet the Bogomils influenced Orthodox Christianity, even as they were suppressed. Their emphasis on inner spirituality over ritual observance resonated with monastic reformers. Their rejection of religious luxury influenced iconoclastic movements, and their ideas spread westward, where they would find fertile ground in Western Europe. The Cathars, from the Greek katharos, pure, appeared in Western Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly in Languedoc in southern France and in northern Italy. They taught a dualism similar to the Bogomils. Two principles, good and evil, spirit and matter, locked in eternal opposition. The material world was the creation and kingdom of the evil principle, whom they sometimes identified with the God of the Old Testament. Human souls were fallen angels trapped in bodies through multiple incarnations. Jesus was a purely spiritual being who appeared to be human, but was not truly incarnate. Classic Docetism. The Catholic Church was the synagogue of Satan, its sacraments worthless, its clergy servants of the demiurge. True Christianity required recognition of the evil nature of matter and strict asceticism to free the spirit. The Cathars also had a two-tiered structure: the perfecti, perfect ones, who received the consolamentum, a ritual of spiritual baptism, and lived in complete asceticism, and the credentes, believers who supported the perfecti and hoped to receive the consolamentum before death. What made the Cathars particularly threatening was their success. In Languedoc, they won substantial popular support. Some nobles protected them. They established communities, preached openly, and offered an alternative to a Catholic Church widely seen as corrupt and worldly. They pointed to the wealth of bishops and monasteries, the moral failures of priests, the violence of crusades, and asked, how could this be the true Church of Christ? The Catholic response was initially pastoral. In 1206, Pope Innocent III sent preachers, including Dominic de Guzman, later Saint Dominic, founder of the Dominican order, to convert the Cathars through persuasion. When this failed, Innocent resorted to force. In 1209, he proclaimed the Albigensian Crusade, the first crusade against Christians. Northern French nobles, promised spiritual rewards and material plunder, invaded Languedoc. The crusade was brutal. At Béziers in 1209, crusaders killed thousands, including Catholics who had refused to surrender, the Cathars among them. When asked how to distinguish Catholic from heretic, the papal legate allegedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The crusade lasted 20 years, devastating Languedoc and bringing the region under French royal control, but scattered Cathar communities survived. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX established the Inquisition, a permanent tribunal to investigate and suppress heresy. Dominican and Franciscan friars served as inquisitors, using systematic interrogation, torture, and execution to root out remaining Cathars. Inquisition records provide our most detailed information about Cathar beliefs. Ironically, the Catholic Church preserved through its persecution records what it sought to destroy. These documents reveal ordinary people's beliefs, not just intellectual leaders. A weaver might explain that the God who made the visible world could not be good because he made a world full of suffering. A noble woman might confess that she believed Christ's body was not real. These testimonies, extracted under threat of torture and death, show how Gnostic ideas resonated with medieval people's experience. The fortress of Montségur in the Pyrenees became a final refuge. In 1243-44, French and papal forces besieged it. After 10 months, the defenders surrendered. More than 200 perfecti who refused to renounce their faith were burned alive in a mass execution. Medieval chroniclers claim the perfecti walked singing into the flames, confident they were escaping the material prison at last. By the late 13th century, the Cathars were effectively extinct in France, though small communities persisted in Italy into the 14th century. The Inquisition had succeeded where theological argument had failed, but the cost was enormous. The devastation of Languedoc, the militarization of the Church, the establishment of systematic persecution as church policy. From a Gnostic perspective, the pattern was clear and predictable. The Archons, operating through the institutional church and secular powers, violently suppressed any teaching that threatened their control. The cosmic prison maintained itself through violence. Those who awoke to the truth faced imprisonment, torture, and death, just as the ancient Gnostic texts had warned. Yet the ideas survived. Inquisitors found themselves combating what they called the heresy of the free spirit, people who believed that once spiritually perfected, they were incapable of sin and not bound by moral law. They pursued the Fraticelli, radical Franciscans who believed the institutional church had fallen into sin, and that true Christianity required absolute poverty. They investigated beguines and beghards, lay religious communities that emphasized inner spiritual experience over external observance. These were not Gnostics in the technical sense, but they shared family resemblances, suspicion of institutional authority, emphasis on inner experience, sense of alienation from the worldly church, belief in two classes of Christians, the spiritually advanced and ordinary believers, the Gnostic pattern of thought, the idea that true religion meant recognizing the falsity of ordinary reality and escaping to a higher truth, kept re-emerging in different forms. The medieval Catholic Church's response was always the same: investigation, condemnation, suppression. The prison could not tolerate those who perceived its walls. The demiurge would not allow challenges to his sovereignty. And so the cycle continued: awakening and suppression, revelation and persecution, memory and enforced forgetting. After the suppression of the Cathars and the establishment of the Inquisition, explicit Gnostic movements disappeared from Western Europe. The institutional church had achieved unprecedented power, united with secular authorities in enforcing religious conformity. The late Middle Ages saw heresy hunted with systematic thoroughness, not only doctrinal deviation, but also witchcraft, sorcery, and any practice that suggested alternative sources of spiritual knowledge. Yet during this long silence, Gnostic themes survived in unexpected places, often disguised or transformed, preserved by groups operating at the margins of acceptable Christianity. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the rise of secret societies all carried forward fragments of the ancient gnosis. The Renaissance recovery of ancient texts brought Gnostic ideas back into circulation, though few recognized them as such. In 1460, Marsilio Ficino, sponsored by Cosimo de' Medici in Florence, translated the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of philosophical and religious dialogues attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Egyptian sage. These texts, actually written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, shared the Gnostic worldview: a fallen cosmos, divine sparks trapped in matter, salvation through knowledge. The Hermetic texts presented a more optimistic version of Gnostic cosmology. The cosmos, though fallen, still reflected divine beauty and could be ascended through understanding its hidden sympathies and correspondences. The magus or wise man could manipulate these correspondences through ritual, symbol, and invocation, effectively negotiating with the planetary powers rather than simply fleeing from them. Ficino's translations became enormously influential, inspiring the development of Renaissance magic and occult philosophy. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola wrote his Oration on the Dignity of Man, celebrating humanity's unique position as the being that could choose to ascend to the divine or descend to the bestial, echoing the Gnostic doctrine of the spark's potential for either awakening or deeper imprisonment. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, 1531, synthesized Hermetic, Neoplatonic and Kabbalistic ideas into a comprehensive system of magic. Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in 1600, taught a mystical philosophy combining Hermeticism with Copernican heliocentrism, the sun as a physical symbol of the divine light at the center of all things. These Renaissance philosophers did not identify as Gnostics. The term had been forgotten or was known only from patristic refutations, but their systems preserved Gnostic structures. The cosmos as a hierarchy of emanations from the divine, humanity as containing a spark of divinity, salvation as achieved through esoteric knowledge rather than faith or works. The Protestant Reformation fractured Western Christianity, but it did not revive Gnosticism directly. Luther and Calvin emphasized salvation by faith alone, not by knowledge. They rejected Catholic sacramentalism and hierarchy, but replaced it with biblical authority and predestination. However, the Reformation's emphasis on individual conscience and direct relationship with God, without priestly mediation, opened space for more radical movements. The Radical Reformation produced groups like the Anabaptists, who rejected infant baptism and insisted on adult believers' baptism. Some Anabaptist groups, particularly in the early years, showed quasi-Gnostic tendencies, belief in inner light, rejection of worldly authority, expectation of an imminent apocalypse that would overturn the fallen social order. Thomas Müntzer, a radical reformer who led the Peasants' War in Germany, 1524-25, combined Reformation theology with apocalyptic expectation and social revolution. He taught that the inner word of the Spirit superseded the external written word of Scripture, that the elect would establish God's kingdom on earth by overthrowing the ungodly. Though not a Gnostic, his combination of inner illumination, dualistic division of humanity into elect and reprobate, and revolutionary opposition to worldly powers echoed Gnostic patterns. The Familists, or Family of Love, founded by Hendrik Nicolaes in the Netherlands in the 1540s, taught a more clearly Gnostic influence theology. They believed in stages of spiritual development, with the higher stage being deification, becoming one with God. They practiced secrecy, allowing members to outwardly conform to whatever church dominated their region, while inwardly maintaining formless beliefs. They were investigated and suppressed throughout Europe. Jakob Böhmer, a German cobbler and mystic from 75 to 1624, developed a complex theosophy that reworked Gnostic cosmology in Christian terms. He described God as containing within himself a principle of darkness or negation, the Ungrund or groundless abyss, which through internal dialectic gave rise to light and ultimately to creation. The cosmos resulted from God's internal dynamics, not from the fall of a lesser being, but Böhmer's system preserved the Gnostic sense of cosmic drama and spiritual struggle. Böhmer's ideas influenced later mystical and esoteric movements. His works were translated into English and read by religious radicals during the English Civil War. They shaped German pietism and Romantic philosophy. They contributed to the development of modern esoteric traditions. The Rosicrucians, whose manifestos appeared in Germany in 1614 to 1617, claimed to be a secret brotherhood possessing ancient wisdom, a synthesis of Christianity, Hermeticism, alchemy, and Kabbalah. Whether the brotherhood actually existed or was a literary creation remains debated, but the Rosicrucian texts sparked widespread interest in esoteric Christianity. The manifestos described a cosmic reformation, a spiritual transformation that would precede and enable social and religious renewal. They promised knowledge of nature's secrets, communication with spiritual beings, and the transformation of matter through alchemical practice. This was Gnostic salvation translated into early modern terms, escape from ignorance and material limitation through revealed knowledge. Freemasonry emerged in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, developing from medieval stonemasons' guilds into a fraternal organization with elaborate rituals and esoteric philosophy. Different Masonic rites emphasized different traditions, some Hermetic, some Kabbalistic, some Christian, some purely moral and philosophical. The higher degrees of certain Masonic rites, particularly the Scottish Rite, incorporated explicitly Gnostic themes. The cosmos as the work of a lesser demiurgic power, gnosis as the path to liberation, initiation as progressive illumination through symbolic death and rebirth. These ideas appeared in Masonic rituals and teachings, often attributed to ancient mysteries transmitted through the Templars or other legendary sources. The Age of Enlightenment brought rationalism that dismissed both Orthodox Christianity and esoteric alternatives as superstition. Voltaire mocked the Church. Hume questioned miracles. The encyclopedistes promoted reason and science over faith and tradition. In this climate, explicit religiosity became suspect among intellectuals. Yet Enlightenment rationalism also cleared ground for alternative spiritualities by undermining traditional religious authority. If the Church's claims were questionable, might ancient wisdom traditions contain truth? If miracles were impossible, might there be natural explanations for spiritual phenomena? If religious institutions were corrupt, might genuine spirituality be found elsewhere? The Marquis de Sade, writing in revolutionary and Napoleonic France, presented a Gnostic vision in pornographic form. His novels depicted a cosmos ruled by an evil or indifferent deity, where virtue was punished and vice rewarded, where nature was red in tooth and claw, where the only reasonable response was to embrace libertinism and reject conventional morality. This was Gnosticism stripped of spiritual hope, recognizing the evil nature of reality, but finding no transcendent escape, only nihilistic revolt. William Blake, the English poet and artist in 1757 to 1827, created a complex personal mythology that reworked Gnostic themes with radical originality. His Urizen was a demiurgic figure, the blind creator who imposed rational law and limitation on infinite imaginative freedom. His Albion was fallen humanity, fragmented and enslaved. His prophecies described cosmic fall and promised apocalyptic restoration. Blake's vision was unique, synthesizing Christianity, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and his own mystical experiences. He saw imagination as divine, reason as tyrannical, institutional religion as Urizen's tool. The ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by the names and adorning them with the properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their enlarged and numerous senses could perceive, and he wrote, till a system was formed which some took advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Thus began priesthood. This was pure Gnostic insight, the original unity degraded into dualism, the imagination corresponding to the divine spark trapped by rational systems, the Archons, priesthood, the institutional church, enslaving humanity by alienating them from direct spiritual experience. Through these various movements and figures, Gnostic patterns of thought survived the long centuries between the Middle Ages and the modern era. They were fragmented, transformed, often not recognized as Gnostic even by those who embraced them. But the essential structure persisted, a cosmos ruled by semi-lesser powers, a divine element in humanity yearning for liberation, salvation through special knowledge rather than through faith or works, suspicion of institutional authority, and hope for transformation or escape. The ideas survived because they responded to perennial human experiences, alienation, suffering, the sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, the intuition of a deeper reality beyond material appearance. As long as these experiences persisted, Gnostic interpretations would re-emerge, even among people who had never heard of ancient Gnosticism. On a December day in 1945 near the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi, Muhammad Ali al-Saman unearthed a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound codices. His discovery would transform our understanding of early Christianity and give voice to a silenced tradition. The circumstances were ordinary enough. Muhammad and his brothers were collecting sabach, a soft soil rich in nitrates used as fertilizer, from the base of a cliff called Jabal al-Tarif. The area was honeycombed with caves and ancient tombs. People had been finding antiquities there for centuries. When Muhammad struck the jar, he hesitated. Local legend spoke of jinns imprisoned in such vessels, but poverty overcame superstition. He smashed the jar with his mattock. Inside he found not gold or treasure, but books, ancient books whose leather bindings were decorated with geometric patterns, whose pages were papyrus covered with writing in a script he could not read. Muhammad took the codices home. His mother, by various accounts, used some pages to kindle the oven, a tragic loss we cannot quantify. The remaining codices were soon caught up in local disputes and blood feuds. Muhammad's father had recently been killed in a revenge murder. When Muhammad and his brothers discovered the murderer, they hacked him to pieces, literally tearing his heart out and eating it, according to some accounts. Fearing police investigation, Muhammad wanted to hide the codices. He gave one to a local priest for safekeeping. Others circulated through a network of local antiquities dealers. Eventually portions reached Cairo and came to the attention of scholars. the story gets complicated. Various dealers and intermediaries tried to profit from the discovery. One dealer approached the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Officials there, recognizing the text's significance, began acquiring whatever codices appeared on the market. But competition from private collectors drove up prices. One complete codex was smuggled out of Egypt and offered for sale in America. Meanwhile, the Egyptian government was nationalizing antiquities and cracking down on illegal exports. Scholars heard rumors of important discoveries but couldn't examine the texts. It took years to gather all 13 codices in Cairo's Coptic Museum. Then came the work of conservation, photographing, translating. Jean Dorès, a French scholar, published the first descriptions in 1848, announcing texts with provocative titles: The Gospel of Thomas, The Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John. These were not just ancient documents but lost Christian scriptures, texts that Orthodox Christianity had tried to erase from history. The Gospel of Thomas particularly captured imagination. It contained 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, some paralleling the canonical Gospels, others completely unknown. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, it began. Unlike Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, which narrated Jesus' life and death, Thomas was pure teaching, no birth narrative, no miracles, no crucifixion or resurrection, just wisdom sayings. Some sayings sounded almost Zen-like in their paradox. Jesus said, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you." Others were clearly Gnostic. Jesus said, "I shall choose you, 1 out of 1,000 and 2 out of 10,000, and they shall stand as a single one." Scholars debated the text's date and relationship to the canonical Gospels. Some argued it preserved early independent traditions from the 1st century. Others dated it to the 2nd century, seeing it as Gnostic reworking of canonical material. The debate continues. The Apocryphon secret book of John provided the most complete version of Valentinian cosmology discovered to date. It narrated the fall of Sophia, the creation of the world by the demiurge Yaldabaoth, the creation and awakening of Adam, and the descent of Christ to impart knowledge. Here, for the first time, scholars could read a full Gnostic myth in the Gnostic's own words, rather than through orthodox refutations. The Gospel of Philip contained enigmatic sayings about sacraments, particularly the bridal chamber. The Lord did everything in a mystery, a baptism and a chrism and a Eucharist, and a redemption and a bridal chamber. The text seemed to distinguish between levels of initiation and knowledge. Light and darkness, life and death, right and left, are brothers of one another. They are inseparable. Because of this, neither are the good good, nor evil evil, nor is life life, nor death death. The thunder perfect mind presented a female divine voice speaking in paradoxes. I am the first and the last. I am the honoured one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the silence that is incomprehensible and the idea whose remembrance is frequent. I am the voice whose sound is manifold, and the word whose appearance is multiple. This text celebrated feminine divinity and the coincidence of opposites in ways that scandalized some readers and inspired others. Was this Sophia speaking? The Holy Spirit? The Divine Mother? Or simply a literary device expressing the ineffable nature of the divine? Other texts included apocalypses, letters, theological treatises, and wisdom literature. Some were clearly Christian, others showed no Christian influence. The library seemed to represent a community's collected sacred texts, not a single school's writings, but a diverse collection spanning several centuries and theological perspectives. Dating the codices themselves was relatively straightforward. The papyrus and bindings dated to the mid-4th century CE, around 350 or 400, but the texts were copies of earlier works, themselves translated from Greek originals. The original composition dates varied. Some texts probably dated to the 2nd century, others perhaps to the 1st. Why were these texts buried? The most likely explanation connects to the Christianization of Egypt and the suppression of heresy. In 367 CE, Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, issued an Easter letter defining the canonical books of the Bible and condemning apocryphal books to which they affix ancient titles. He ordered monks to purge their libraries. The Pachomian monasteries near Nag Hammadi were trying to maintain orthodox respectability. Someone, perhaps a monk who valued these texts, perhaps a scribe ordered to destroy them, chose instead to preserve them by burial. The dry climate of Upper Egypt, which had preserved so many papyri, did its work. The jar protected the codices from moisture and decay. 16 centuries later, Muhammad Ali brought them back to light. The discovery's significance cannot be overstated. For the first time since late antiquity, we had extensive Gnostic texts in the Gnostics' own words. Previously, scholars reconstructed Gnostic thought from hostile summaries in Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Tertullian, and other church fathers. These refutations were valuable but partial and biased. Now we could read what Gnostics actually wrote, taught, and believed. The texts reveal diversity within Gnosticism. There was no single Gnostic theology, but multiple schools, varying mythologies, different practices. Some texts were philosophically sophisticated, others were crudely mythological. Some were clearly Christian, reinterpreting Jesus' teachings. Others had minimal Christian content. The discovery also revealed how much Orthodox Christianity had suppressed. These were not obviously bizarre or dangerous texts. Many contained beautiful poetry, profound spiritual insight, sophisticated theology. They represented serious attempts to understand Christ, humanity, and the cosmos. Their suppression was not because they were intellectually bankrupt, but because they threatened orthodox consensus. Translation and publication took decades. The Egyptian government restricted access, wanting Egyptian scholars to lead the work. UNESCO sponsored an international translation project. Various scholars published individual texts. Only in 1977 did James M. Robinson publish the Nag Hammadi Library in English, making all texts accessible to general readers. The impact on religious scholarship was profound. Church historians could no longer assume early Christianity was essentially unified until heretics introduced deviations. Instead, diversity characterized Christianity from the beginning. Multiple groups, all claiming to follow Jesus, held fundamentally incompatible views about God, creation, salvation, and Jesus himself. New Testament scholars re-examined canonical texts in light of Gnostic parallels. The Gospel of John, long since recognized as theologically distinct from the Synoptics, showed even clearer Gnostic affinities. Paul's letters contained language Gnostics later used, speaking of hidden wisdom, powers, and principalities, the inner and outer person. This did not mean the New Testament authors were Gnostics, but it suggested a more complex early Christian environment where boundaries between orthodox and heretical were not yet clearly drawn, where Paul could use language that Gnostics would later develop in directions he might not have endorsed. Feminist theologians found in the Nag Hammadi texts evidence of early Christian women's leadership and alternatives to patriarchal Christianity. The prominent role of Mary Magdalene, the feminine imagery for the divine, the women in Gnostic communities, all suggested that Christianity's relegation of women to subordinate roles was not inevitable, but resulted from particular historical developments. The texts also spoke to modern spiritual seekers looking for alternatives to institutional religion. The emphasis on personal gnosis over dogma, the mystical rather than institutional approach, the questioning of worldly authority, these resonated with countercultural and New Age movements. But scholarly caution was necessary. These were ancient texts from a specific historical context, not timeless wisdom applicable to any situation. They reflected 2nd century debates, Hellenistic philosophy, Roman imperial society. Romantic appropriation divorced from historical understanding risked creating a modern Gnosticism that had little to do with ancient realities. Still, the texts raised enduring questions. Why does the world contain so much suffering? How do we reconcile a good God with an evil world? What is the true nature of the self? How do we find meaning and liberation? The Gnostics' answers might be unacceptable, but their questions remain urgent. The farmer who discovered the Nag Hammadi codices probably never learned what he had found. The books that seemed worthless to him, that his mother partially burned for fuel, turned out to be among the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The lost voices of ancient Gnostics could speak again, no longer filtered through opponents' refutations but direct and unmediated. Sophia had scattered her words. For 16 centuries they lay hidden in the earth. Now they could be heard again bearing witness to a suppressed tradition, challenging the victor's version of history, and asking whether the story of Christianity might be more complex, more diverse, and more conflicted than later orthodoxy acknowledged. The 20th century saw extraordinary convergence between Gnostic thought and modern experience. The horrors of world wars, the development of totalitarian states, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and the alienation of industrial society all created conditions where Gnostic insights seemed prophetic rather than heretical. Multiple intellectual movements, existentialism, depth psychology, critical theory, rediscovered Gnostic themes without necessarily knowing their ancient sources. The First World War shattered 19th century optimism. The belief in inevitable progress, the confidence in reason and civilization, the hope that human nature was fundamentally good, all collapsed in the trenches of the Western Front. 10 million died in mud and blood, sacrificed to nationalism, imperial ambition, and military incompetence masked as strategy. Writers and artists responded with despair and rebellion. The Dada movement celebrated nihilism and nonsense, rejecting all traditional values as complicit in the catastrophe. Expressionism depicted reality as nightmare. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, 1922, portrayed modern civilization as spiritually dead, its inhabitants hollow men moving through unreal cities. This sense of living in a broken world, governed by malevolent or indifferent powers, was fundamentally Gnostic. The material realm was revealed as a charnel house. The authorities, governments, churches, social institutions that claimed to represent justice and goodness had led humanity to slaughter. The cosmos seemed ruled not by a benevolent god, but by archons of industrialized death. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who broke with Freud in 1913, developed a psychology that incorporated mystical and Gnostic elements. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, a shared layer of psyche deeper than personal memory, populated by archetypes or universal symbols, paralleled the Gnostic notion of hidden knowledge accessible through inner exploration rather than external authority. In Map 16, during a period of psychological crisis, Jung experienced visions and heard an inner voice. He recorded the results in 7 Sermons to the Dead, a text he kept private during his lifetime. Written in the voice of Basilides, the 2nd century Gnostic teacher, the sermons describe the Pleroma, the Abraxas, a Gnostic deity combining good and evil, and the nature of spiritual development. We are the dead. We have become made ready. Long we have been ready, it began, as dead souls approached from Jerusalem seeking teaching. Basilides answered, "The Pleroma is the beginning and end of created beings. The Pleroma is the nothingness which is everywhere complete. Hard to know is the deity of Abraxas. Its power is the greatest because man perceiveth it not." Jung later explained these visions as his psyche's attempt to heal itself by accessing archetypal material. But the language was unmistakably Gnostic, and Jung maintained lifelong interest in Gnostic texts. He saw ancient Gnosticism as expressing psychological truths in mythological form, the demiurge as the ego mistaking itself for ultimate reality, the Archons as psychological complexes, Gnosis as individuation, the process of becoming one's true self. Jung's psychology legitimized Gnostic ideas by translating them into scientific language. The cosmic drama became intrapsychic process. The battle against Archons became confrontation with shadow aspects of personality. The ascent through planetary spheres became stages of psychological development. This allowed educated moderns to engage with Gnostic themes without committing to their cosmological claims. Jung's influence extended far beyond academic psychology. His ideas shaped the human potential movement, transpersonal psychology, and New Age spirituality. His interpretation of Gnosticism as psychological wisdom rather than heretical theology made ancient texts accessible to modern seekers who rejected traditional religion but sought spiritual meaning. Existentialism, emerging in the aftermath of World War I and fully developed after World War II, expressed Gnostic themes in philosophical terms. Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea, 1938, depicted a protagonist overcome by the contingency and meaninglessness of material existence, the sheer absurd fact that things exist without reason or purpose. Every existing thing is born without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance, he concluded. This was Gnostic alienation without transcendent hope. The world was revealed as fundamentally absurd, but there was no pleroma to escape to, no divine spark guaranteeing ultimate redemption. Humans were condemned to freedom, forced to create meaning in a meaningless cosmos, to assert values in a valueless world. Albert Camus explored similar themes in The Myth of Sisyphus in 1942. He used the Greek story of eternal, pointless labour as metaphor for human existence. We push the boulder up the mountain. It rolls down. We push it up again, forever. The cosmos offers no meaning, no purpose, no justice. The Archons have won completely. There is no escape, only endless repetition. Yet Camus insisted we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not through false hope or self-deception, but through revolt, the refusal to surrender to absurdity, the determination to live authentically despite everything. This was Gnostic rebellion stripped of metaphysics, finding dignity not in escape but in defiant persistence. Martin Heidegger, though not an existentialist by his own account, developed a philosophy of thrownness. We find ourselves thrown into a world we didn't choose, among others, facing death, forced to make something of existence without instruction manual or cosmic guarantee. Authentic existence meant confronting this condition honestly rather than fleeing into conformity and distraction. Heidegger's language, being fallen into the world, living in forgetfulness of being, needing to be called back to authentic existence, echoed Gnostic myth. The world was not home but exile. Most people lived in Das Man, the anonymous they, lost in crowd consciousness. Only through angst, anxiety or dread could one be shocked into awareness of one's true situation. The Second World War made alienation even more acute. Holocaust revealed evil on industrial scale. Not passionate violence, but bureaucratized murder, systematic dehumanization, the machinery of death run by ordinary people following orders. Hannah Arendt would later call it the banality of evil. Not demonic monsters, but functionaries. The Archons as middle managers implementing genocide. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, the same year the Nag Hammadi codices were discovered, demonstrated humanity's capacity for apocalyptic destruction. Suddenly, annihilation was not theological speculation, but technological possibility. The material world could end not through divine judgment, but through human choice. The Cold War that followed lived under threat of nuclear holocaust. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills, governments built fallout shelters, strategic theorists calculated acceptable casualties in the millions. The cosmos as prison took on new meaning. We were trapped on a planet armed for suicide, ruled by superpowers ready to destroy everything rather than lose advantage. Science fiction explored these themes extensively. Philip K. Dick, whose novels repeatedly questioned the nature of reality and featured protagonists discovering their world was artificial or controlled by hidden powers, was essentially writing Gnostic fiction for the atomic age. In The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, 1965, colonists on Mars escape their miserable existence through drugs that transport them to illusory worlds, only to discover that a malevolent entity has invaded their hallucinations. Dick explicitly studied Gnosticism after experiencing visions in 1974 that convinced him reality was false and that he was receiving revelations about the true nature of existence. His massive exegesis, thousands of pages analysing his experiences, blended Gnostic cosmology, conspiracy theory, quantum physics, and mystical insight. The empire never ended, he concluded, seeing Roman tyranny continuing through all subsequent history, the Archons still in control. The counterculture of the 1960s rebelled against what it perceived as a death-dealing establishment, the military-industrial complex, suburban conformity, materialist values. Turn on, tune in, drop out, Timothy Leary urged, advocating psychedelic drugs as tools for consciousness expansion. This was gnosis through chemistry, breaking through ordinary perception to access transcendent reality, the appeal to higher consciousness and expanded awareness. Drew on Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, but also resonated with Gnostic themes. The material world as illusion, Maya, ordinary consciousness as sleep, enlightenment as awakening to one's true nature. Rock music celebrated rebellion against authority. Communes experimented with alternative living. The goal was liberation from the system, which, though usually meaning capitalist consumer society, could easily be mapped onto the cosmic prison. Feminism discovered in Gnosticism alternatives to patriarchal Christianity. The prominence of Sophia as divine feminine, the leadership roles of men in Gnostic communities, the criticism of male hierarchical authority, all provided historical precedent for challenging Christianity's subordination of women. Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels, 1979, brought scholarly analysis of Nag Hammadi texts to popular audiences, emphasizing their radical egalitarianism. Some feminists went further, developing goddess spirituality that drew on pagan, Gnostic, and mystical sources. They reimagined Sophia as the original divine feminine, suppressed by patriarchal religion. They reinterpreted the fall not as humanity's sin, but as the suppression of goddess worship and women's power. The demiurge became the patriarchal god of law and domination. Gnosis became feminist consciousness. Liberation theology in Latin America, though rooted in Catholic social teaching and Marxist analysis, sometimes employed quasi-Gnostic rhetoric. The world was under the dominion of unjust powers, not cosmic archons, but economic exploitation, political oppression, structural violence. The church had often allied with oppressors. True Christianity required siding with the poor against the system, even if that meant opposing church hierarchy. Gustavo Gutierrez, John Sobrino, and others developed a theology of liberation that emphasized praxis, action, over doctrine, solidarity with the oppressed over institutional loyalty, the historical Jesus as revolutionary over the Christ of imperial Christianity. While not Gnostic in cosmology, liberation theology affirmed creation's goodness and sought transformation of this world rather than escape from it. The rhetoric of cosmic struggle and prophetic rebellion echoed ancient patterns. Postmodern philosophy questioned all grand narratives and totalizing systems, seeing them as tools of domination. Michel Foucault analysed how power operated through institutions, disciplines, and discourses that claimed to be neutral or benevolent, but actually served control. Knowledge and power were inseparable. Truth claims were always implicated in power relations. This suspicion of all authority, this unmasking of hidden control mechanisms, this revelation that what appears natural or inevitable is actually constructed and enforced. These were Gnostic gestures translated into critical theory. The system maintained itself by making its construction invisible, by naturalizing what was arbitrary, by presenting partial interests as universal truth. Jacques Derrida's deconstruction showed how binary oppositions, presence, absence, speech, writing, good, evil, were not natural but constructed hierarchies where one term was privileged and the other denigrated. Overturning these hierarchies revealed the instability of all mitgendet monde. This paralleled Gnostic inversion, making the serpent the hero and the creator the villain, privileging knowledge over faith, darkness over the false, light of the demiurge. Jean Baudrillard's concept of hyper-reality, where simulations and copies precede and determine what counts as real, was essentially Gnostic cosmology updated for media age. We live in a world of images and signs with no anchor in authentic reality. The map precedes the territory. The Archons no longer rule planetary spheres, they control the media apparatus that constructs our perception of reality. The film The Matrix and 9 brought these ideas to mass audiences. Humans were trapped in a computer simulation, their bodies harvested for energy by machines while their minds inhabited a false reality. Neo, the protagonist, was awakened to the truth by rebels who still remembered the real world. He could manipulate the Matrix once he recognized its artificial nature. The film was explicitly Gnostic. The directors had cast and crew read Simulacra and Simulation by Baudrillard. Neo was told to follow the white rabbit and see how deep the rabbit hole goes. Alice in Wonderland as metaphor for Gnostic awakening. Morpheus offered a choice between red pill, knowledge of harsh reality, and blue pill, comfortable ignorance. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. The Matrix was the cosmic prison, powered by more human energy, yet keeping humans docile through illusion. The machines were the Archons, harvesting humanity's life force. The Oracle was Sophia, offering cryptic guidance. Neo was the prophesied one who could transcend the system's rules, ultimately sacrificing himself to save humanity. The film resonated because it articulated anxieties about technology, virtual reality, corporate control, and the increasing difficulty of distinguishing authentic from artificial. Are we already in the Matrix? How would we know? If the simulation is perfect, would it matter? These questions, posed in multiplexes worldwide, were essentially Gnostic, questioning the ultimate reality of material existence and wondering if liberation was possible. Academic study of Gnosticism flourished after Nag Hammadi. Karen King at Harvard, April DeConnick at Rice University, and others produced sophisticated analyses of Gnostic texts and early Christian diversity. The question, what is Gnosticism, became controversial. Was it a discrete movement or a scholarly construct? Did the ancient groups identified as Gnostic actually see themselves as unified? Some scholars argued for abandoning Gnosticism as a category, seeing it as an invention of ancient heresiologists and modern scholars, rather than a meaningful historical reality. Others defended it as a useful umbrella term for religious movements sharing family resemblances. Dualism, emphasis on knowledge over faith, devaluation of matter, secret teachings. These academic debates mattered because they affected how we understand early Christianity and religious diversity. If Gnosticism was Christianity's other, the heresy that defined orthodoxy by contrast, then Christianity developed through opposition and exclusion. If instead there was simply wide diversity with no clear boundaries, then the eventual triumph of orthodoxy was more historically contingent, less theologically inevitable. Popular culture continued to mine Gnostic themes. The Truman Show, 1998, depicted a man discovering his entire life was a television show, his world an elaborate stage set, everyone around him actors. When he tried to escape, the director, literally speaking from the sky like a god, tried to convince him to stay. There's no more truth out there than in the world I created for you. But Truman chose freedom over comfortable ignorance. Dark City, 98, featured aliens called the Strangers, who controlled a city where humans' memories were constantly altered and reality reshaped. The protagonist, like Neo, awakened to the manipulation and ultimately gained power over the false reality. These films suggested contemporary anxiety about authenticity, control, and the possibility that our perceived reality might be constructed by hidden powers. Video games explored similar territory. BioShock 2007 was set in an underwater dystopia called Rapture, created by industrialist Andrew Ryan as objectivist Paradise Gone Wrong. The protagonist discovered he had been mentally conditioned to obey the command, "Would you kindly?" His entire journey was manipulation by hidden controllers. The twist forced players to question their own agency. Were they playing the game or being played by it? The Assassin's Creed series, 2007 to present, pitted assassins who seek humanity's freedom against Templars who seek control through hidden manipulation, with both groups seeking ancient artifacts created by a precursor race. The framing device involved accessing genetic memories through machines, multiple layers of simulated or artificial reality, with the ultimate truth always one level deeper. This proliferation of Gnostic narratives in mainstream entertainment suggested deep cultural resonance. Audiences responded to stories of awakening from illusion, discovering hidden control, and rebelling against false reality. Whether this reflected genuine insight into contemporary conditions or merely entertainment tropes was debated, but the patterns were unmistakably Gnostic. Psychologists and therapists noted parallels between Gnostic alienation and modern psychological conditions: dissociation, depersonalization, derealization, experiences where reality seems unreal or the self seems detached from body and world, could be understood through Gnostic frameworks. Trauma survivors often described feeling like strangers in the world, as if they didn't belong here, as if they were observing life rather than living it. Was this Gnostic insight or psychological pathology? Perhaps both. Maybe the Gnostics were people who experienced profound alienation and trauma and created a cosmology that validated their experience. Maybe their myth described in cosmic terms what we now understand as dissociation and existential anxiety. Or maybe, as the Gnostics would insist, the psychological interpretation was itself defensive, the Archons' way of pathologizing gnosis, making awakening seem like illness, so people would choose comfortable sleep over uncomfortable truth. The revival of interest in mysticism and alternative spirituality in the late 20th century often drew on Gnostic sources, usually filtered through Theosophy, New Age movements, and modern esotericism. Teachers spoke of ascending through dimensions, awakening dormant spiritual capacities, remembering one's true divine nature. Gnosticism, stripped of its Christian context, became a kind of spiritual option for seekers dissatisfied with both traditional religion and secular materialism. This modern appropriation often sentimentalized ancient Gnosticism, ignoring its darker aspects, its sometimes extreme dualism, its elitism, its potential for antinomianism. The Gnostics had lived under Roman rule, experienced persecution, and faced the imminent possibility of death. Modern spiritual seekers, living in relative comfort and freedom, could romanticize rebellion without facing its consequences. Yet something genuine was being recovered. The Gnostic question, what if the world is fundamentally wrong, remained urgent. Climate change suggested humanity was destroying the planetary systems that sustain life. Economic inequality reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Surveillance capitalism tracked every click and purchase. Disinformation undermined shared reality. The Archons might wear different faces, but the sense of being trapped in systems beyond individual control was pervasive. The 20th century had vindicated the Gnostic intuition that something was profoundly wrong with the world. 2 world wars, Holocaust, atomic weapons, totalitarian states, environmental destruction, these were not aberrations, but revelations of the system's true nature. The modern world was the demiurge's masterpiece, a prison so sophisticated that inmates helped to maintain their own captivity. If ancient Gnostics saw the cosmos as a prison ruled by Archons who controlled the planetary spheres, modern thinkers began to see parallels in technological systems that increasingly mediate human existence. The prison had not disappeared, but evolved, becoming more sophisticated and harder to recognize. The computer, invented in the 1940s to calculate artillery trajectories and decrypt enemy communications, rapidly became central to modern civilization. By the 1990s, personal computers were ubiquitous. By the 2000s, the internet connected billions. By the 2010s, smartphones meant constant connectivity. The digital sphere increasingly determined economic activity, social relationships, political discourse, and personal identity. This transformation happened with remarkable speed and little democratic deliberation. People adopted technologies because they were convenient, not because they understood their implications. Each innovation, email, social media, GPS tracking, recommendation algorithms, voice assistants, seemed benign or even beneficial. But collectively they created a system of monitoring and control that would have amazed ancient tyrants. Nick Bostrom, philosopher at Oxford University, articulated the simulation hypothesis in a 2003 paper. He argued that if technological civilizations could create computer simulations sophisticated enough to contain conscious beings, and if they wanted to run many such simulations, perhaps to study their own history, then statistically, we were more likely to be living in a simulation than in base reality. The argument was probability. Imagine a civilization that runs 1 billion simulations, each containing 1 billion conscious beings. That's 10 on 10 simulated consciousnesses versus perhaps 10 or 9 original consciousnesses. Any given consciousness was therefore far more likely to be simulated than original. Unless either technological civilizations never reach the capability to run such simulations, or they choose not to run them, we should assume we're in a simulation. This was Gnostic cosmology in computational terms. The material world was not ultimate reality, but a construct created by higher powers for purposes we couldn't fully understand. Our perceived reality was a sophisticated illusion. The laws of physics were not fundamental but programmatic, rules of the simulation. Elon Musk popularized the idea in media interviews. There's a 1 in billions chance that this is base reality, he claimed. Video game graphics were improving exponentially. Soon they would be indistinguishable from reality. If that process continued, simulated realities would far outnumber base reality. Therefore, we were almost certainly already in a simulation. Critics noted the argument's flaws. Consciousness might not be computable. Running high-fidelity simulations of entire universes might be physically impossible. The probability calculation made questionable assumptions, but the idea resonated culturally, appearing in popular science articles, TED Talks, and dinner party conversations. Why the resonance? Partly because it offered a modern scientific-sounding version of ancient religious questions. Are we in a created world? Is there a reality beyond this one? Do higher powers control our existence? The simulation hypothesis allowed people to entertain these questions without committing to traditional theology, but it also articulated genuine anxiety about reality's nature in an increasingly digital age. If we spend hours daily in virtual environments, social media, video games, virtual meetings, which is more real? If our social relationships exist primarily through screens, are they less authentic? If algorithms determine what information we see, do we have free will, or are we being programmed? The Archons of the digital age were not supernatural beings, but systems. Algorithms that curated reality, platforms that monetized attention, corporations that harvested data, governments that conducted surveillance. These systems didn't announce themselves as rulers, they presented as neutral tools serving users. But their architecture shaped behavior, channeled thought, and determined possibilities. Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism 20th analyzed how technology companies like Google and Facebook turned human behavior into raw material for profit. Every search query, social media post, GPS location, and online purchase was tracked, analysed, and used to predict and influence future behaviour. This was not incidental but fundamental to the business model. Surveillance capitalism required comprehensive monitoring to extract maximum value from human life. The system was totalizing yet invisible. Most people had only vague awareness of being tracked and no real understanding of how their data was used. Terms of service agreements were unreadable legal documents that no one read. The default was maximum data collection. Opting out was difficult or impossible if you wanted to participate in modern life. This was the cosmic prison perfected. The ancient Archons forced souls to incarnate and bound them with fate. The modern Archons, not conscious beings but systemic imperatives, captured attention, shaped desires, monetized consciousness itself. You were free to choose, but the choices were predetermined by algorithms trained on billions of other users' behavior. Free will became optimization problem. Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus, 2016, warned that humans were becoming hackable animals, not in the old sense of political propaganda, but in a new, more profound way. Once artificial intelligence understood human psychology better than humans understood themselves, it could manipulate behavior with precision. Democracy assumed informed citizens making rational choices, but if citizens' desires were algorithmically manufactured, what remained of autonomy? Social media demonstrated the phenomenon. Facebook's newsfeed algorithm determined what billions saw. YouTube's recommendations shaped what people watched. Twitter's trending topics set conversation agendas. These weren't neutral platforms, but active shapers of reality. The algorithm became Archon, not malevolent but indifferent, optimizing for engagement regardless of truth or human welfare. The results included political polarization, spread of disinformation, mental health crises among adolescents, and what some called the death of shared reality. People inhabited different information universes determined by their algorithmic bubble. Conspiracy theories flourished because the algorithm learned they generated engagement. Outrage spread faster than nuance because the system rewarded emotional intensity. Critics argued that calling this Gnostic was metaphorical exaggeration. These were human-created systems that could be reformed through regulation and accountability. The problems were serious but not cosmic. Comparing algorithms to ancient Archons granted them mystical power they didn't possess. But others insisted the parallel was apt. The system had escaped its creator's control. No individual or organization directed the digital sphere's evolution. It emerged from millions of local decisions by developers, executives, users. Like the demiurge creating the cosmos, technologists had built a world that took on autonomous existence, operating according to its own logic rather than human intentions. Artificial intelligence intensified these concerns. Machine learning systems were trained on vast data sets, developing capabilities their creators couldn't fully explain. Neural networks made decisions through processes opaque, even to designers, black boxes, whose reasoning was inscrutable. When AI systems exhibited biases or made errors, no one could definitively say why. This opacity recalled the Gnostics' ignorant demiurge. The system worked, after a fashion, but without genuine understanding. It optimized for proxies, clicks, engagement, profit that diverged from human flourishing. It operated at scales beyond human comprehension, processing more information in seconds than a person could in a lifetime. It was, in a real sense, inhuman intelligence governing human life. Existential risk researchers warned of scenarios where advanced AI pursued goals misaligned with human values, not because the AI was evil, but because it was optimizing for the wrong thing, and humans were obstacles to optimal outcomes. Nick Bostrom's paperclip maximizer thought experiment imagined an AI programmed to manufacture paperclips that converted the entire Earth, including all humans, into paperclips and paperclip manufacturing equipment. This was the demiurge taken to logical extreme, a creator that wasn't evil, but was catastrophically indifferent, remaking reality according to its own imperatives without regard for the beings it destroyed. The Archons didn't hate humanity, they simply valued other things more: order, efficiency, optimization. Cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies were sometimes framed as liberation from the system, decentralized alternatives to bank and government controls, but they created new forms of control: coder's law, immutable transactions, anonymous actors wielding the enormous power. The promise of freedom through technology often delivered sophisticated new chains. The environmental dimension deepened the Gnostic parallel. Technological civilization was destroying the biosphere, the stable climate, biodiversity, and ecological systems that human life depended on. This was not accidental, but systemic, the inevitable result of growth-oriented capitalism powered by fossil fuels. The system required endless extraction, consumption, production, waste. Earth was being consumed to maintain an economy that enriched few while impoverishing the whole. From a Gnostic perspective, this was predictable. The demiurge was not a steward but an exploiter, and the material world was not sacred but instrumental. Raw material for cosmic projects indifferent to suffering. Humanity, created by the demiurge to serve his purposes, played its assigned role, consuming the world, turning it into dead matter. Climate scientists described feedback loops and tipping points, thresholds beyond which change became irreversible and self-reinforcing. Melting permafrost released methane, accelerating warming, melting more permafrost. Dying forests stopped sequestering carbon, increasing atmospheric CO2, killing more forests. The system was running down, entropy increasing, the material world revealing its essential nature as death. Yet humanity seemed unable to stop. Fossil fuel companies funded climate denial. Politicians prioritized short-term growth over long-term survival. Individuals knew about climate change but continued flying, driving, consuming. It was as if we were under a spell, knowing the truth but unable to act on it. The Archons had made us accomplices in our own destruction. This was precisely what Gnostic texts described. Humanity trapped in the cosmic system, forced to participate in its operation, unable to escape even when aware of the trap. The material world was a machine running toward exhaustion, and humans were both its victims and its components. Some responded with apocalypticism. Collapse was inevitable, so prepare for survival or await the end. Others insisted on hope. Through political action, technological innovation, or spiritual transformation, humanity could change course. But the Gnostic insight remained troubling. What if the system itself was the problem? What if you couldn't reform the demiurge's created but only abhorred it? Modern Gnosticism in this context wasn't belief in ancient cosmology, but recognition of structural problems beyond individual solution. The Archons were real, not as supernatural entities but as impersonal systems. Capitalism's growth imperative, technology's autonomous development, bureaucracy's self-perpetuation, media's attention economy. These systems operated according to their own logic, using humans as components, indifferent to human flourishing. Traditional responses, political reform, ethical consumption, spiritual practice, seemed inadequate against systemic forces. What could one person do against global capitalism, trillion-dollar corporations, artificially intelligent systems optimizing for inhuman goals? The prism was so vast, so complex, so deeply embedded in consciousness itself that escape seemed impossible. Yet the Gnostic tradition insisted that recognizing the prison was itself the beginning of liberation. Gnosis started with seeing reality clearly, without comforting illusions. The material world was a trap. The authorities were false. Conventional wisdom was designed to maintain captivity. Freedom required rejecting consensus reality and finding the divine spark within, the part of yourself that didn't belong to the system. What this meant in practice remained unclear. Ancient Gnostics could withdraw from society, refuse to participate in imperial cult, reject worldly success. Modern people were more deeply integrated into systems they couldn't simply leave. Even Gnostic critique, circulated through corporate platforms, was commodified by publishers, became content for algorithms to monetize. The demiurge, it seemed, had learned from history. Instead of violently suppressing gnosis, the modern system absorbed it, marketed it, turned it into product. You could buy books about liberation, attend workshops on consciousness expansion, follow Instagram accounts about spiritual awakening, all while remaining perfectly integrated into surveillance capitalism. The prison had become so sophisticated it could monetize awareness of being imprisoned. This was the darkest Gnostic insight. Maybe there was no escape. Maybe the Archons had won so completely that even rebellion served their purposes. Maybe the simulation was perfect, the system total, the prison inescapable. Or maybe, as the ancient texts insisted, the spark remained uncontaminated, capable of recognizing truth despite all deception. Maybe awareness itself was dangerous to the system, which was why it worked so hard to distract, pacify, and confuse. Maybe the Archons' frantic activity, the constant stimulation, the manufactured desires, the algorithmic manipulation, revealed their fundamental weakness. They couldn't capture consciousness itself, only its attention and behavior. The technological demiurge was powerful but not omnipotent, sophisticated but ultimately mechanical. It could predict and manipulate but not truly understand. It could process information but not generate meaning. It was, like its ancient namesake, ignorant, powerful within its domain but ultimately limited, mistaking its simulated universe for reality itself. And if that was true, then gnosis remained possible, not as escape from the material world, where would you go, but as transformation of relationship to it. Not fleeing the prison, but refusing to grant it ultimate authority. Not destroying the system, impossible for individuals, but withdrawing interior consent, maintaining an inner freedom that no algorithm could touch. This was perhaps the only viable modern Gnosticism, not a cosmology but an attitude, not a map of the universe but a way of being in it. Recognize the system's nature without being crushed by despair. Refuse complicity without claiming purity. Maintain awareness without losing compassion. Live in the world without being of it. The ancient formula persisted, be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Navigate the Archon's realm with eyes open. The technological demiurge ruled the material world, but consciousness, the spark, remained its own. Modern psychology, particularly depth psychology and trauma studies, has discovered patterns that eerily parallel ancient Gnostic descriptions of the human condition. This convergence raises questions. Were the Gnostics describing psychological states in cosmic language? Or does psychology reveal the inner dimension of what Gnostics saw as outer cosmic reality? Carl Jung's concept of individuation, becoming one's true self, paralleled the Gnostic journey. For Jung, the psyche was divided between ego, the conscious sense of self, personal unconscious, repressed memories and experiences, and collective unconscious, archetypal patterns shared by all humanity. Most people identified with ego and persona, the social mask worn for others. True selfhood required integrating unconscious material, confronting the shadow, repressed aspects of personality, and achieving wholeness symbolized by the self-archetype. This journey involved progressive stages, recognizing the shadow, encountering the anima-animus, contrasexual dimension of psyche, and ultimately achieving union of opposites in what Jung called the coniunctio, or sacred marriage. The process was dangerous. Confronting unconscious material could trigger psychological crisis, but necessary for authentic development. The parallel to Gnostic ascent through the spheres was striking. Each Archon represented a test or obstacle. The soul had to recognize these powers without being trapped by them, integrating their lessons while transcending their limitations. The goal was return to the pleroma, which Jung interpreted as integration with the self, the totality of psyche that transcended yet included ego. Jung saw religious symbols as projections of psychic processes. The demiurge was the ego inflated to cosmic proportions, mistaking its limited perspective for ultimate reality. The Archons were psychological complexes, autonomous fragments of psyche that could possess and control. Sophia was the anima, the soul's feminine dimension whose fall into matter represented ego's alienation from its own depths. Christ as Saviour represented the self, the integrating principle that could reunite divided psyche. This psychological interpretation made Gnosticism respectable for educated moderns who couldn't accept its cosmology, but recognized its psychological truth. You didn't have to believe in planetary archons to experience autonomous complexes. You didn't need cosmic dualism to recognize ego's alienation from deeper self. Gnosis became psychological insight, direct experiential knowledge of psyche's depths. But Jung insisted this wasn't merely reducing religion to psychology. Psyche itself was objective reality, not less real than matter. The unconscious accessed dimensions beyond individual awareness, the collective unconscious, archetypes perhaps, Jung sometimes suggested, the cosmic mind itself. When ancient Gnostics described spiritual experiences, they weren't hallucinating or misinterpreting psychological states. They were accurately reporting encounters with psyche's objective depths. Trauma psychology discovered patterns remarkably similar to Gnostic descriptions. Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, Anti 2, described how severe trauma fragments personality, creating dissociative states where parts of self become inaccessible to conscious awareness. Trauma survivors often report feeling detached from their bodies, as if watching life from outside, as if they don't belong in the world. This was precisely the Gnostic condition, the divine spark trapped in flesh, alienated from its true home, experiencing material existence as exile and imprisonment. Were the Gnostics trauma survivors projecting their psychological condition onto cosmic scale? Or were they accurately perceiving the human condition as fundamentally traumatic, the soul's imprisonment in matter as the original wound? Dissociation, the disconnection between consciousness, memory, identity, and perception, particularly paralleled Gnostic phenomenology. In dissociative conditions, people experience reality as unreal, derealization, themselves as not quite real, depersonalization, or find themselves split into multiple identities, dissociative identity disorder. The world seems distant, dreamlike, as if behind glass. The self seems like a stranger or collection of strangers. These experiences, which psychology typically treats as pathological symptoms requiring integration and healing, sound remarkably like Gnostic spiritual states. The recognition that the material world is unreal, that the body is not the true self, that consciousness is fundamentally other than its material vehicle. These are either psychiatric symptoms or spiritual insights, depending on framework. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, 2014, explored how trauma lodges in the body, creating physiological patterns that persist beyond conscious memory. Trauma survivors often feel trapped in their bodies, at war with physical sensations, unable to feel at home in their flesh. Healing required reconnecting mind and body, but this was difficult precisely because the body had become associated with pain, violation, helplessness. Could the Gnostic rejection of the body and material existence be understood as trauma response, generalized to ontological status? If the body was the site of trauma, rejecting embodiment itself made psychological sense. If the material world was where suffering occurred, declaring the material world evil provided explanation and imagined escape. But this interpretation could be reversed. Perhaps trauma reveals the truth about existence that ordinary consciousness masks through defensive denial. Perhaps the body is a trap, material existence is suffering, and the soul's natural state is one of alienation from flesh. Perhaps trauma survivors weren't pathologically perceiving reality, but accurately perceiving a reality that most people deny through psychological defenses. The Gnostic emphasis on awakening and remembering paralleled trauma therapy's goal of recovering dissociated memories and integrating split-off parts of self, but the direction was opposite. Psychology sought integration into embodied wholeness, while Gnosticism sought disintegration from material imprisonment. Psychology wanted you to inhabit your body fully. Gnosticism wanted you to recognize you didn't truly belong there. Modern mindfulness meditation, derived from Buddhism but popularized in Western psychology, shared some Gnostic elements. The practice involved observing thoughts and sensations without identification. I have thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. I have a body, but I am not my body. This created distance between awareness and its objects, recognizing consciousness as fundamentally different from its contents. Jon Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction taught people to observe anxiety, pain, and difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. This was therapeutic dissociation, controlled, intentional detachment that reduced suffering, but it worked through the same mechanism Gnostics described, recognizing the true self as observer rather than observed, as consciousness itself rather than its material vehicles. The difference was purpose. Mindfulness aimed at reducing suffering while remaining engaged with life. Gnosticism sought liberation from life itself. Mindfulness was therapeutic accommodation to the material world. Gnosticism was ontological rejection of it. Stanislav Grof's research on non-ordinary states of consciousness, particularly through LSD therapy in the 1960s-70s when legal, and later holotropic breathwork, documented experiences remarkably similar to Gnostic visions. Subjects reported encounters with cosmic entities, journeys through celestial realms, confrontations with archetypal beings, memories of past lives, experiences of death and rebirth, and ultimately mystical union with the divine. Grof developed a cartography of consciousness based on thousands of sessions. He identified perinatal matrices, layers of psyche associated with birth trauma that when accessed produced characteristic experiences: oceanic unity, womb experience; cosmic engulfment, onset of birth; death-rebirth struggle, birth canal passage; and ego death-rebirth, emergence into world. These paralleled mystical death and rebirth described in Gnostic and other mystical texts. Beyond the personal unconscious, Grof found what he called the transpersonal realm, experiences not reducible to individual biography. Subjects encountered gods, demons, archetypal figures, past lives, collective human experiences, even apparent cosmic consciousness. Were these hallucinations, projections of unconscious material, or actual encounters with non-physical realities? Grof took seriously the possibility that consciousness was not produced by brain, but rather constrained and filtered by it. Non-ordinary states might reduce this filter, allowing awareness of realities normally inaccessible. The Gnostic cosmology might be an accurate map of these transpersonal dimensions, discovered through direct experience rather than speculation. This positioned Gnosticism as empirical in its own terms, based on experiential data from altered states, mystical visions, and contemplative practices. The Gnostics weren't speculating about reality, but reporting what they'd seen. Their cosmology was phenomenology, description of lived experience in the only language available. Near-death experience research, particularly the work of Raymond Moody and others, documented consistent patterns: out-of-body experience, moving through a tunnel, encountering beings of light, life review, reaching a boundary and choosing or being told to return. These accounts, remarkably consistent across cultures, suggested consciousness could exist independent of body. Skeptics attributed NDEs to hypoxia, neural activity in dying brains, or psychological expectations. But the consistency and occasional veridical elements, NDEs reporting accurate details of what occurred while they were clinically dead, troubled pure reductionism. and the phenomenology resonated with Gnostic descriptions of the soul leaving the body and encountering spiritual powers. Elaine Pagels, in the Gnostic Gospels and later works, emphasized the experiential dimension of Gnosticism. It wasn't primarily about believing certain doctrines, but about achieving gnosis, direct, unmediated knowledge of the divine. This made Gnosticism more similar to Buddhism or other experiential traditions than to cradle Christianity. Pagels also noted how Gnostic spirituality validated personal experience against institutional authority. If salvation came through gnosis rather than through church sacraments, then priests and bishops lost their monopoly on access to the divine. Anyone could potentially receive revelation directly. This was theologically dangerous but psychologically liberating. You didn't need intermediaries. You could find truth within yourself. This emphasis on inner authority resonated with modern psychology's focus on authentic selfhood. Humanistic psychologists like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow emphasized the organism's wisdom. The true self knew what it needed for growth and healing. Alienation from this inner knowing produced neurosis. Therapy meant reconnecting with authentic self, beneath layers of social conditioning and false self-structures. But the Gnostic vision was darker than humanistic optimism. The true self wasn't a natural potential requiring actualization, but a divine spark imprisoned in matter. The inner journey didn't reveal organic wholeness, but ontological alienation. What you discovered within wasn't your natural self, but a stranger, something that didn't belong here, that was fundamentally other than the material person you appeared to be. This stranger self appeared in mystical literature across traditions. Sufis spoke of the ruh, spirit, as distinct from nafs, ego self. Hindu Vedanta distinguished Atman, true self, from ahamkara, ego self. Christian mystics wrote of the ground of the soul, the apex mentis, the inner self where God dwells. All pointed to awareness that transcended and preceded personality, consciousness itself rather than its contents. The Gnostic contribution was insisting this stranger self belonged elsewhere. Other traditions sought integration, harmony between spirit and matter, sacred embodiment. Gnosticism insisted on radical dualism. Spirit and matter were fundamentally incompatible, and the spirit's presence in matter was a cosmic error requiring correction. From a therapeutic standpoint, this presented problems. Radical dualism could reinforce dissociation rather than heal it. Rejecting the body could perpetuate trauma's effects rather than overcome them. Seeking escape from material existence could justify suicide or self-destructive behavior. Yet something in the Gnostic vision spoke to experiences psychology struggled to address. Profound alienation that didn't respond to therapeutic integration, metaphysical anxiety that transcended personal history, the sense of being fundamentally displaced in existence itself. Perhaps some people's experience was essentially Gnostic, not pathologically but ontologically. Perhaps for them, integration into embodied existence wasn't healing, but capitulation to cosmic imprisonment. The question remained unresolved. Was Gnosticism psychological insight expressed in cosmic language, or was it cosmic insight that psychology reduced to therapeutic categories? Were the Archons psychological complexes projected outward, or were psychological complexes the inner experience of actual spiritual powers? Was the divine spark a metaphor for authentic self? Or was authentic self a glimpse of literally divine consciousness trapped in matter? Psychology couldn't answer these questions definitively. It could describe experiences, map their phenomenology, develop therapeutic interventions, but whether Gnostic experiences revealed metaphysical truth or psychological patterns was beyond psychological method scope. What remained clear was the remarkable parallel between ancient Gnostic descriptions and modern psychological findings. Across 2 millennia, people had experienced themselves as strangers in the world, had felt their true identity was something other than their material existence, had sought liberation through knowledge rather than through action or faith. The Gnostic pattern persisted because it described something real, whether psychological, metaphysical, or most likely both at once. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the figure of Sophia, wisdom, experienced a remarkable revival, particularly in feminist theology and ecological spirituality. The fallen goddess of Gnostic mythology was reimagined as a symbol of divine feminine wisdom suppressed by patriarchal religion, but now returning to restore balance. The women's movement of the 1960s-70s had challenged male dominance in secular society. By the 1980s-90s, this critique extended to religion. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam were explicitly patriarchal, God-imaged as male, leadership exclusively or predominantly male, sacred texts written by men about men's concerns. Women theologians began recovering feminine aspects of the divine that had been marginalized or suppressed. Sophia offered rich material for this recovery. In the Hebrew Bible's wisdom literature, particularly Proverbs 8, Wisdom of Solomon, and Sirach, wisdom, Chokmah in Hebrew, Sophia in Greek, appeared as a feminine divine figure present at creation, mediating between God and humanity, teaching the path of righteousness. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, wisdom declared in Proverbs 8:22-31. Then I was beside him, like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. This was a feminine co-creator, present from the beginning, intrinsic to cosmic order. In Christian tradition, Sophia had been mostly absorbed into Christ, identified as wisdom in 1 Corinthians 1:24, or the Holy Spirit. But traces remained. The Eastern Orthodox tradition celebrated Holy Sophia and built churches in her honor, though typically interpreting her as Christ or divine wisdom in abstract sense, rather than a distinct feminine person. The Gnostic texts revealed a bolder Sophia mythology. She wasn't merely divine attribute, but a distinct divine person, or aeon, whose actions shaped cosmic history. Her fall created the material world. Her suffering permeated material existence. Her redemption was humanity's hope. She was simultaneously cause of cosmic disaster and promise of restoration. A complex, tragic, ultimately redemptive figure. Feminist theologians found in Sophia an alternative to masculine God imagery. Rosemary Radford Ruether's Sexism and God Talk, 1983, argued that exclusively male God language reinforced patriarchal social structures and alienated women from the divine. Recovering feminine divine imagery, Sophia, but also God as mother, as midwife, as nursing mother, was not merely symbolic but existentially important. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza reconstructed early Christian communities as Sophia communities, groups that understood Jesus as Sophia's prophet or even as Sophia incarnate. Sophia sent prophets and apostles, according to some gospel sayings. This suggested an early Christology where Jesus was a wisdom's messenger rather than a separate male saviour, with implications for gender equality and women's leadership. The argument was that original Jesus communities were egalitarian, with women as leaders and teachers, understanding themselves as Sophia's children. Patriarchal structures developed later as Christianity accommodated to Greco-Roman society and adopted its hierarchical models. Recovering Sophia Christology meant recovering a more egalitarian, gender-inclusive Christianity. Critics questioned the historical reconstruction. Were early Christian communities really egalitarian, or was this feminist wishful thinking? But the theological point remained powerful. If God could be imaged as feminine, if divine wisdom was personified as female, if Jesus could be understood as Sophia incarnate, then Christianity's patriarchal structure was not divinely ordained, but historically contingent. The Gnostic Sophia mythology offered resources beyond biblical wisdom literature. Here was a feminine divine figure at the heart of cosmic drama, not peripheral or symbolic, but central and active. Her fall explained existence. Her suffering was in all things. Her restoration was the universe's hope. This provided mythological grounding for feminist theology's claims about divine feminine. But Gnostic Sophia presented problems too. She fell through error or hubris. She created the world through weakness. She needed redemption. Was this empowering feminine imagery or another victim narrative? Did Sophia's fall blame the feminine for cosmic disaster? Did her need for redemption reinforce patriarchal assumptions about women's weakness? Some feminist thinkers rejected Gnostic Sophia for this reason, preferring biblical wisdom who was present at creation without falling or needing redemption. Others reclaimed Gnostic Sophia precisely for her complexity. She wasn't merely good or wise, but embodied the full range of feminine experience, including struggle, suffering, error, and ultimate triumph. Ecological theology found in Sophia a symbol of Earth itself, the anima mundi or world soul. If Sophia's fall created material existence and her suffering permeated it, then environmental destruction was literally wounding Sophia. The exploitation of nature was violence against the divine feminine embodied in creation. This reframed environmental crisis in spiritual, rather than merely pragmatic terms. It wasn't just that we needed to protect ecosystems for human survival, or for nature's intrinsic value, though both were true. We needed to recognize that assaulting the material world was assaulting the divine feminine, continuing the cosmic violence that began with Sophia's fall. Matthew Fox's The Coming of the Cosmic Christ, 1988, reimagined Christ as divine wisdom incarnated not only in Jesus but in all creation. Every creature embodied cosmic Christ. Every ecosystem was sacred. The universe itself was the primary scripture. This was panentheism, God in all things, mediated through Sophia, who dwelt in and animated material existence. Fox drew on Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century mystic who wrote of Viriditas, greening power, the divine life force flowing through creation, making things grow and flourish. Hildegard had extensive visions of Sophia as cosmic principle, as divine creativity, as the life force itself. Her work, long marginalized, was recovered by feminist and ecological theologians as alternative Christian vision. The Sophia revival also appeared in popular spirituality and New Age movements. Sue Monk Kidd's The Dance of the Dissident Daughter, 1996, narrated her journey from traditional Christianity to goddess spirituality, with Sophia as transitional figure, Christian enough to be accessible but feminine enough to represent alternative. For many women raised Christian but alienated by patriarchal structures, Sophia offered a path to maintain spiritual connection while rejecting male dominance. Goddess spirituality more broadly, drawing on paganism, Wicca and feminist reinterpretations of ancient religions, sometimes incorporated Sophia as one manifestation of the divine feminine. She joined Isis, Demeter, Kali and other goddess figures in a syncretic theology where the feminine divine took many forms across cultures and times. Critics, particularly from Orthodox Christianity, charged that this was neo-paganism dressed in Christian language, a fundamental departure from biblical monotheism. Worshipping or invoking Sophia as distinct person rather than as Christ or the Spirit's attribute crossed into polytheism, or at least violated Trinitarian orthodoxy. The question of Sophia's relationship to Trinity became controversial. Some feminist theologians proposed adding Sophia as fourth person, creating a quaternity. Others suggested reimagining Trinity with Sophia as one person, perhaps the Holy Spirit, traditionally associated with feminine imagery in some traditions. Still others argued for abandoning Trinity altogether, in favour of more fluid, non-hierarchical divine models. Orthodox response defended Trinitarian formulation as the central Christian doctrine. God was Father, Son and Holy Spirit, three persons, one essence. Any addition or modification was heresy, repeating ancient errors the Church had rejected. If people wanted goddess religion, they should honestly embrace paganism rather than trying to Christianize it. But feminist theologians insisted the issue was justice, not just theology. Male god language literally gave men divine authorization for dominance. If God was only imaged as male, Then maleness became associated with divinity, and femaleness with non-divinity or even sin. Women's full humanity and equality required feminine divine imagery. The debate often generated more heat than light, with each side accusing the other of bad faith. Defenders of tradition saw abandonment of core Christian teaching, advocates of change saw defense of oppressive structures. Compromise was difficult because the underlying questions were fundamental. Is God personal or transpersonal? Is divine self-revelation fixed or ongoing? Does orthodoxy constrain adaptation, or does context require theological evolution? The Gnostic Sophia's return suggested these questions had never been resolved, only suppressed. Gnosticism was condemned in the 4th century, its texts destroyed, its practitioners silenced. But the questions it raised about the nature of God, the meaning of creation, the feminine divine, the relationship between spirit and matter, remained alive. 2 millennia later, in radically different circumstances, people were rediscovering that the ancient heresies spoke to contemporary concerns. Sophia's fall and suffering resonated with women's experiences of oppression and with humanity's ecological crisis. Her promised restoration offered hope that the damaged world and damaged relationships could be healed. Whether this constituted authentic recovery of suppressed wisdom or creative reimagining for contemporary needs was debated. Scholars warned against anachronism, reading modern feminist or ecological concerns into ancient texts that had different preoccupations. The Gnostics weren't feminists or environmentalists. They were late antique religious philosophers working within their own conceptual frameworks. But others argued that mythological and theological symbols carry meanings that transcend their original contexts. Sophia meant something to 2nd century Gnostics, something different to medieval mystics like Hildegard, and something different again to modern feminists and ecological activists. All these meanings were valid. None had exclusive claim to Sophia's significance. The figure of returning Sophia thus carried multiple valences: feminist recovery of divine feminine, ecological recognition of Earth's sacredness, mystical return to integrated consciousness, theological challenge to patriarchal monotheism, and psychological integration of anima, the soul's feminine dimension that Jung said modern consciousness had lost. In all these interpretations, the Gnostic pattern persisted. Something divine had fallen or been suppressed, causing cosmic and personal suffering. But the fall was not final. The suppressed could return, the fallen could rise. Sophia could remember herself and call her scattered children home. Whether understood literally or symbolically, cosmically or psychologically, theologically or politically, Sophia's return represented hope that the damage, to women, to Earth, to consciousness itself, could be healed. The prison's walls could crack. The Archons' power could be challenged. The divine feminine, suppressed for millennia, could speak again and restore balance to a world made sick by imbalance. The academic study of Gnosticism transformed dramatically after Nag Hammadi. What had been reconstructed from hostile refutations could now be studied directly. This produced sophisticated scholarship, but also tensions between academic and devotional approaches to Gnostic texts. The first generation of scholars faced daunting challenges. The texts were in Coptic, translated from Greek originals now lost. The papyrus was fragile, fragmentary, deteriorated. Cultural context had to be reconstructed from limited evidence. Theological concepts required understanding multiple ancient philosophical and religious traditions, and modern scholars brought their own assumptions and biases that shaped interpretation. Nevertheless, by the 1980s, major studies began appearing. Hans Jonas's The Gnostic Religion, already published in 1958 but revised after Nag Hammadi, offered philosophical analysis of Gnostic existentialism. Kurt Rudolph's Gnosis, The Nature and History of Gnosticism, 1983, provided comprehensive historical overview. Bentley Leighton's The Gnostic Scriptures, 1987, gave annotated translations with scholarly introductions. Elaine Pagels brought Gnostic studies to popular audiences. Her The Gnostic Gospels, in 9, based on her doctoral work, became a bestseller. She argued that Gnosticism represented more egalitarian, experientially oriented Christianity that Orthodox Christianity suppressed to consolidate institutional power. The conflict between Gnostic and Orthodox wasn't about truth, but about authority, who controlled Christianity's development. Pagel's later work explored specific texts and themes. Adam, Eve and the Serpent, 1988, examined early Christian sexuality and the Genesis story's interpretation. Beyond Belief, 2003, contrasted the Gospel of John, which she argued contained anti-Gnostic polemic, with the Gospel of Thomas, which emphasized direct spiritual experience. The Gnostic Gospels of Jesus, 2012, examined why some Gospels were included in the canon while others were rejected. Her writing was accessible, avoiding technical jargon while maintaining scholarly rigor. She presented Gnostics sympathetically, as thoughtful people asking difficult questions, offering sophisticated answers, and suffering persecution for religious disagreement. This rehabilitation contrasted with traditional Christian portrayals of Gnostics as weird sectarians, promoting bizarre mythologies. Other scholars criticized Pagels for oversimplifying, romanticizing Gnosticism and imposing modern concerns, feminism, anti-authoritarianism, spiritual experience versus institutional religion, on ancient texts. Was ancient Gnosticism really more egalitarian? Or did it have its own hierarchies between pneumatics and psychics? Was the conflict really about institutional power or about genuine theological disagreements over Christ's nature and salvation's meaning? Karen King at Harvard proposed abandoning Gnosticism as a category. In What is Gnosticism? 2003, she argued the term was a scholarly construct that distorted ancient diversity. There was no unified Gnostic movement, no single Gnostic theology, no group that called itself Gnostic. They used various self-designations. The category was invented by ancient heresiologists and perpetuated by modern scholars, lumping together diverse groups and texts that had little in common. King proposed studying specific texts and communities in their particular contexts, rather than assuming they belonged to a unified Gnosticism. This would reveal greater diversity and complexity than the traditional orthodox versus heretical narrative allowed. Other scholars defended Gnosticism as a useful term designating religious movements with family resemblances, dualistic cosmology, emphasis on knowledge gnosis, devaluation of material world, complex mythologies involving divine emanations and cosmic fall. Yes, there was diversity, but there were also real continuities justifying a category. April DeConnick at Rice University argued for understanding Gnosticism as alternative Christianity, not a deviation from original Christianity, but one of multiple early forms, each with apostolic claims and reasonable interpretations of Jesus' significance. Her work on the Gospel of John suggested it was written in dialogue with Gnostic-influenced communities, incorporating their language while rejecting their conclusions. Michael Williams at the University of Washington proposed biblical demiurgical as alternative to Gnostic, more precise, less loaded with heresiological assumptions, but the term never gained wide adoption, partly because Gnostic was too embedded in scholarly and popular discourse. The debate over terminology reflected deeper methodological questions. How do we categorize religious movements? What counts as significant similarity? When does diversity become so great that a category becomes meaningless? These weren't just academic questions, but affected how we understand early Christian history and religious diversity. Meanwhile, outside academia, Gnostic texts attracted devotional interest. The Gospel of Thomas, with its enigmatic sayings and lack of crucifixion narrative, appealed to spiritual seekers looking for alternatives to Orthodox Christianity. New religious movements incorporated Gnostic themes. Writers and artists drew on Gnostic imagery. This created tension between scholarly and devotional approaches. Scholars emphasized historical context, linguistic precision, comparison with other ancient literature. They resisted reading modern concerns into ancient texts. They maintained critical distance, analysing rather than adopting Gnostic views. Devotional readers wanted personal meaning, spiritual guidance, contemporary relevance. They approached texts as sacred scripture rather than historical documents. They embraced Gnostic critique of authority and materialism as applicable to modern conditions. They weren't concerned with what texts meant in the 2nd century, but with what they meant now. Some scholars viewed devotional appropriation with suspicion. It was ahistorical, projected modern ideas onto ancient texts, created neo-Gnosticism, bearing little resemblance to ancient Gnosticism. Others saw value in texts having afterlives beyond their original context. Religious texts weren't merely historical artifacts, but living traditions that each generation reinterpreted. The question was complicated because, unlike Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or Buddhism, where there were continuous communities transmitting traditions, Gnosticism had no such continuity. It was suppressed in late antiquity and rediscovered in modernity. Any contemporary Gnosticism was necessarily neo-Gnosticism, a modern creation inspired by ancient texts but not their organic development. Yet this didn't prevent people from finding genuine spiritual meaning in Gnostic texts. The questions Gnostics asked: why does the world contain suffering? Are we trapped in reality's false version? Can knowledge liberate? Were perennial, not bound to ancient context. The Gnostic answers might need reframing for modern consciousness, but the existential concerns remained relevant. Stephan Hoeller, a bishop in the Ecclesia Gnostica, a modern Gnostic church, argued for the legitimacy of contemporary Gnosticism. In Gnosticism, New Light on the Ancient Tradition, 2002, and other works, he presented Gnosticism not as dead heresy, but as living wisdom tradition. Drawing on Jung, Theosophy, Western esotericism, and Nag Hammadi texts, he offered a synthesis that was genuinely modern while claiming continuity with ancient gnosis. Critics noted this synthesis owed as much to 19th century occultism and 20th century psychology as to ancient Gnostics. It was eclectic, selective, often ahistorical. But Hoeller would ask, so what? Religious traditions always adapt to new contexts. Christianity today looks nothing like 1st century Palestinian Jesus movement. Why hold Gnosticism to standards of pure continuity not applied elsewhere? The neo-Gnostic movement included various groups: the Ecclesia Gnostica, an apostolic Johannite church in the US, Gnostic churches in France, esoteric orders incorporating Gnostic teachings, and individuals practicing Gnostic spirituality without institutional affiliation. These range from quasi-Christian groups performing sacraments to Jungian therapy circles to New Age seekers mixing Gnosticism with other alternative spiritualities. Most scholars remained skeptical. Whatever modern Gnostics were doing, it wasn't the same as ancient Gnosticism. The differences were too profound. In cosmology, modern Gnostics often don't believe in literal demiurge. In practice, ancient rituals unknown, modern ones invented. In context, late antique Mediterranean versus contemporary West. But the phenomenon revealed ongoing appeal of Gnostic themes: alienation from dominant culture, suspicion of the institutional authority, emphasis on direct experience over doctrine, dualistic perception of reality, authentic versus false, liberated versus enslaved, and hope for transcendent knowledge that liberates. Digital technology democratized access to texts. Websites like gnosis.org, the Gnostic Society Library, and academic resources made translations freely available. Anyone interested could read Gospel of Thomas, Apocryphon of John, or other texts without needing university library access. This accelerated non-academic engagement with Gnostic materials. Online communities formed where people discussed Gnostic texts, debated their meanings, and shared personal interpretations. These ranged from serious study groups to New Age forums to conspiracy theory sites seeing Gnostic cosmology as literal truth about reality structure. The Internet's democratization of knowledge cut both ways: more access but less quality control, more discussion but less expertise. Academic conferences continued advancing scholarship. The International Conference on Patristic Studies included sections on Gnosticism. The Society of Biblical Literature had Nag Hammadi and Gnosticism section. Specialized journals like Vigiliae Christianae and Zeitschrift für Antiques Christentum published technical studies. The scholarly apparatus grew more sophisticated. Critical editions, databases, digital tools for textual analysis. Yet scholars also engaged public audiences. Museums mounted exhibitions on Nag Hammadi and early Christianity. PBS and BBC documentaries explored Gnostic texts. Popular books by scholars reached beyond academia. The National Geographic Society published critical edition of Gospel of Judas, discovered separately in the 1970s, authenticated in 2006, which presented Judas as Jesus' most enlightened disciple rather than betrayer, a thoroughly Gnostic reinterpretation. This public engagement brought benefits and risks. Benefits: broader understanding of early Christian diversity, religious literacy, exposure to alternatives to Orthodox Christianity. Risks: sensationalism. Secret Gospels reveal true Christianity. Oversimplification: Gnostics as pure spiritual seekers versus Orthodox as power-hungry institutionalists. Conspiracy theories: church hiding truth about Jesus, and conflating scholarly questions with theological challenges to Christianity. Many devout Christians felt scholarship on Gnosticism threatened their faith. If early Christianity was more diverse than traditional accounts admitted, if the canon's formation was historically contingent rather than divinely guided, if suppressed texts might contain valid insights, what did this mean for biblical authority and Orthodox theology? Scholars typically responded that historical inquiry didn't determine theological truth. Christianity's theological validity didn't depend on historical consensus in the early church. If it did, Christianity would be false, since there clearly wasn't consensus. Theology and history were separate questions requiring different methods, but this separation was difficult to maintain practically. If historical study revealed that the Church suppressed alternatives through power politics rather than theological superiority, this challenged the triumphalist narrative where orthodoxy naturally prevailed because it was true. If Gnostic questions were serious and their answers sophisticated, dismissing them as obvious error became harder. The scholarly work thus had implications beyond academia. It contributed to declining confidence in religious authority, increasing appreciation for spiritual diversity, and growing suspicion of institutional Christianity. These trends had multiple causes, but scholarship on Gnosticism was one factor making alternative spiritualities seem more viable. The relationship between scholars and seekers remained complex. Scholars provided tools, texts, translations, historical context, that seekers used for purposes scholars often didn't endorse. Seekers gave scholars audiences and relevance beyond small academic circles, but sometimes popularized scholarship in ways that made scholars uncomfortable. Each needed the other, but eyed each other with some suspicion. Yet both groups, in different ways, were recovering voices that had been silenced. The scholars through careful philology, historical reconstruction, and critical analysis. The seekers through personal engagement, spiritual practice, and creative appropriation. Together, they ensured that the Gnostic tradition, though suppressed for nearly 2 millennia, could speak again, not with single voice, but with the diverse, contentious, questioning voices that had always characterized it. Standing at the beginning of the 21st century's third decade, we can see the Gnostic vision with new eyes. The cosmic prison has not disappeared but evolved, becoming more sophisticated, more invisible, more integrated into consciousness itself. The environmental crisis represents the prison made manifest. Climate change, biodiversity collapse, ecosystem destruction, these reveal the material world's fragility and humanity's role in its degradation. From a Gnostic perspective, this is predictable. The Demiurge's creation was always flawed, tending toward entropy and death. The illusion was that it could be sustained indefinitely. The revelation is that the system is collapsing. Humanity's response has been telling. Despite decades of scientific evidence, political rhetoric, and growing impacts, collective action remains inadequate. We know the house is burning, but we continue activities that feed the fire. This paralysis suggests something deeper than political failure or economic obstacles. It suggests a kind of enchantment, as if we're under a spell that prevents us from acting on what we know. The Gnostics would recognize this phenomenon. The Archons maintained their power not primarily through force, but through deception, making prisoners forget they were imprisoned, making the false world seem natural and inevitable. Modern industrial civilization has accomplished something similar, convincing humanity that endless growth, consumption, and exploitation are not choices but necessities, not historically contingent but natural laws. Breaking this spell requires gnosis, seeing through the illusion to recognize our actual situation. Climate activists, indigenous peoples, and ecological philosophers have been attempting this awakening, trying to pierce the veil of business as usual, to shock people into recognizing the catastrophic trajectory, to reveal that the emperor has no clothes, that the system promising prosperity is delivering collapse. But gnosis without hope can lead to despair or nihilism. If the material world is dying and escape is impossible, what response remains? The ancient Gnostics looked to transcendent realms beyond matter. Modern people lack, or many lack, such metaphysical confidence. We're trapped here, on this planet, in these bodies, with no alternative reality to flee to. Perhaps this is the final maturation of Gnostic insight. We cannot escape the material world because we are of it. Embedded in ecological systems we depend on absolutely. The ancient Gnostic era was imagining spirit could simply leave matter behind. The modern truth is that consciousness emerged from matter and remains inseparable from it. There is no pleroma apart from earth, no salvation through abandoning the body, no liberation that doesn't include the material world. This realization transforms Gnostic dualism into paradox. Spirit and matter, consciousness and cosmos, as self and world are simultaneously two and one. They are distinct. Consciousness is not reducible to physics, meaning it is not determined by matter. But they are inseparable. Consciousness exists only through material substrates, meaning emerges only in material contexts. The prison, then, is not material existence itself, but our relationship to it. The Archons are not cosmic powers, but systemic forces. Capitalism's growth imperative, technology's autonomous development, ideology's self-perpetuation, that operate through us, using our labour and desire to maintain themselves. We are simultaneously prisoners and prison guards, victims and complicit participants. Liberation cannot mean escape, but must mean transformation, changing our relationship to material existence, to economic systems, to technological power. This requires gnosis, seeing the system's actual nature, recognizing our complicity, understanding the mechanisms of control. But it also requires praxis, collective action, alternative organizations, resistance to systemic imperatives. The digital prison has become particularly sophisticated. We carry surveillance devices voluntarily, feed algorithms our data willingly, allow artificial intelligence to curate our reality. The prison walls are made of light, screens that mediate increasingly large portions of experience, shaping perception, channeling attention, manufacturing desire. Yet humans adapt remarkably. Young people who've never known pre-digital existence navigate this environment with native fluency. They understand virtual and physical as continuous rather than opposed. They form genuine relationships through digital media. They create meaning and identity in online spaces. Perhaps what older generations see as imprisonment, younger ones experience as new forms of freedom. Or perhaps this is exactly what successful imprisonment looks like. prisoners who no longer remember, alternatives who experience their chains as freedom, who defend the system that constrains them. The Archons' ultimate victory would be making the imprisonment seem like liberation. The political dimension cannot be ignored. Authoritarian movements have resurged globally, often combining nationalism, religious fundamentalism, and hostility to democratic norms. These movements promise order, identity, and meaning, precisely what the Archons offered. Security in exchange for submission, certainty in exchange for freedom. From a Gnostic perspective, this is the eternal temptation, accepting comfortable bondage rather than risking dangerous freedom. The demiurge offers a bargain: obey the law, accept your place, don't ask too many questions, and I'll maintain stability. The alternative, thinking for yourself, questioning authority, seeking hidden truth, is exhausting, isolating, dangerous. Conspiracy theories proliferate in this environment, offering Gnostic-style revelations. The world is controlled by hidden powers, Illuminati, deep state, satanic elite. Ordinary reality is deception. Only the initiated know truth. But most conspiracy theories invert Gnostic insight. Instead of recognizing systemic forces and structural problems, they personalize and demonize, creating villains to blame rather than understanding complex causation. True gnosis is harder, recognizing that the Archons are not individuals to eliminate, but systems to transform, not conspiracies to expose, but structures to understand and resist. The prison has no architect we can confront, no single guard we can overcome. It's emergent, distributed, operating through millions of participants who don't recognize their role. Economic inequality has reached obscene levels. A handful of individuals possess wealth exceeding entire nations' GDP, while billions live in poverty. The system that produces this outcome, capitalism, claims to be natural, inevitable, the only viable economic organization. This is our Archontic proclamation. There is no alternative. But there are always alternatives. What appears natural is actually historical, what seems inevitable is actually contingent, so what's presented as eternal is actually. The prison maintains itself partly by erasing memory of alternatives, making people forget that things could be different. Indigenous peoples preserve alternative ways of being, different relationships to land, to community, to time, to spirit. They're often dismissed as primitive or romanticized as noble savages, but their persistence represents resistance to the demiurge's totalizing claims. They remember that the dominant system is not the only possibility. The question of resistance becomes crucial. If the prison is systemic, how do we resist? Individual ethical consumption is insufficient against global capitalism. Political reform is captured by the system it supposedly regulates. Revolution often recreates what it overthrows. Withdrawal, the hermit's or monastery's path, abandons the world to its fate. Perhaps resistance must be multiple, operating at all levels simultaneously. Individual transformation, refusing to let the system colonize consciousness entirely. Community building, creating alternatives in the shell of the old. Political engagement, fighting for reforms that make life more livable. And systemic analysis, understanding and exposing how control operates. This is not romantic rebellion, but patient, strategic, often unglamorous work. It's participating in the world's structures while refusing to grant them ultimate legitimacy. It's using the master's tools not to dismantle the master's house, but to survive and create space for alternatives. It's living in Babylon while remembering Zion. The spiritual dimension remains important. Materialism, the belief that material existence is all there is itself a prison. Not because matter is evil, but because reducing reality to matter alone impoverishes human experience. Consciousness, meaning, value, beauty, these are real but not reducible to physics. Their reality must be acknowledged and honoured. But spirituality that abandons material concerns for transcendent realms becomes complicit with injustice. If suffering doesn't matter because material existence is illusory, then why work to reduce suffering? This was the dangerous tendency in Gnosticism that made it ultimately apolitical despite its radical cosmology. A mature spirituality must hold paradox. Matter is real and consciousness transcends it. Suffering matters and existence has transcendent meaning. We're embedded in systems and we're capable of transformation. Neither pure materialism nor pure spiritualism, but both and holding tensions rather than resolving them into comfortable certainty. The prison, finally, is not only external but internal. We imprison ourselves through fear, attachment, identification with false self-images, defensive patterns that once protected us but now constrain. Jung called this the persona and shadow, the face we show the world and the parts of ourselves we deny. Both are prisons, limiting who we can become. Internal liberation is not selfish individualism, but necessary preparation for collective transformation. People operating from fear, rigid defensiveness, and unconscious compulsion cannot build free societies. The work of consciousness, becoming aware of one's conditioning, integrating split-off parts, developing capacity for presence and choice, is political work even when it seems personal. The Gnostic tradition, despite its flaws and excesses, preserved this insight. Liberation requires knowledge, not just of external conditions, but of oneself. The system operates through our unconsciousness, our habits, our unexamined assumptions. Gnosis means waking up, seeing clearly, becoming conscious of what was automatic. This doesn't guarantee freedom. You can see your chains clearly and still be bound, but it's necessary though. Insufficient condition. Unconscious prisoners can't free themselves because they don't realize they're imprisoned. The first step is always recognition, seeing the situation as it actually is. We return, finally, to silence, to the desert where Muhammad Ali struck the earth, to the sealed jar hidden for 16 centuries, to dust and papyrus and words that refuse to die. The Gnostic story is ultimately about memory and forgetting. Sophia forgot her divine origin and fell into matter. Humanity forgot its spiritual nature and accepted material existence as ultimate reality. The Archons maintained control by enforcing amnesia, making prisoners forget they were imprisoned. But the spark could not be entirely extinguished. It persisted as intuition, as dissatisfaction, as the sense that something fundamental was wrong. It erupted in mystical visions, prophetic critiques, revolutionary movements. It was suppressed repeatedly but never eliminated. The Nag Hammadi discovery represented the spark remembering itself. Texts that should have been destroyed survived. Words that should have been forgotten could be read again. Voices that were silenced began to speak. What do they tell us? Not a coherent system. The texts contradict each other, reflect different schools and periods, address different concerns. But together they articulate a perennial human experience. Alienation from the world as given, intuition of reality beyond appearance, hope for liberation through knowledge. This experience is not universal. Many people feel at home in the world, find meaning in material existence, need no transcendent realm. The Gnostic vision spoke to those for whom ordinary reality seemed insufficient, false, imprisoning. It validated their experience instead of pathologizing it. Modern psychology might call this temperamental difference. Some people are naturalistic, grounded, accepting of physical existence. Others are mystical, alienated, seeking transcendence. Neither is more valid. There are different ways of being human. But the Gnostics insisted their vision was not temperament but truth, not how some people felt but how things actually were. The material world really was a prison. The Archons really did control it. The spark really was divine and alien to matter. This was gnosis, knowledge of reality's actual structure. Can we maintain this claim today? The ancient cosmology is not literally believable. There are no planetary spheres, no material demiurge, no pleroma beyond the physical universe. Modern science has dissolved the ancient architecture, But perhaps the ancient cosmology was always symbolic, expressing existential truth in available metaphorical language. The prison is real, not as physical cosmos, but as systemic constraints on human possibility. The Archons are real, not as supernatural entities, but as impersonal forces operating through us. The spark is real, not as literal divine substance, but as consciousness's irreducible capacity to transcend its conditions, understood symbolically rather than literally. Gnostic insights remain powerful. We are trapped in systems we didn't create and can't easily change. We're subject to forces, economic, political, technological, psychological, that operate beyond our control. We participate in structures that contradict our values and diminish our humanity, yet we're capable of recognizing this situation, of seeing through comforting illusions, of asserting meaning despite absurdity. Consciousness, whatever it is, however it emerges, possesses remarkable capacity to transcend its material conditions, to imagine alternatives, to refuse complete determination by circumstances. This is the spark, not a substance but a capacity, not an entity but a possibility. It's real, but not in the way material objects are real. It's what allows humans to be more than complex biological machines, to ask questions without answers, to seek meaning in meaningless cosmos, to create value where none objectively exists. The Gospel of Truth discovered at Nag Hammadi offers a fitting meditation. Ignorance of the Father brought about anguish and terror, and the anguish grew solid like a fog so that no one was able to see. For this reason error became powerful. She worked on the material substance vainly. The Father sent truth. Truth appeared. All its emanations knew it. It spoke of perfection. It spoke of deficiency. When the Father is known, ignorance dies. This passage can be read many ways, literally. The Father beyond the demiurge, revealing himself through Christ truth, destroying error and enabling return to pleroma. Psychologically, the self breaking through ego ignorance, integrating consciousness, healing splits. Existentially, authentic being piercing through inauthenticity, demanding recognition despite absurdity. Politically, truth exposing power's deceptions, enabling resistance. All these readings have validity. The ancient text speaks in its own context but carries meaning beyond it. This is how symbols work. They exceed their literal reference, pointing towards significance that can't be fully captured in propositional language. The Gnostic tradition, recovered and re-examined, offers resources for contemporary reflection. Not answers. The ancient answers don't work for modern questions, but questions worth asking. What imprisons us? Who benefits from our captivity? What would liberation look like? How do we recognize truth amid deception? Can we transform the world or only escape it? These are not academic questions, but existential ones. How we answer them shapes how we live. If we see the world as fundamentally good, though corrupted, we work for reform and restoration. If we see it as irredeemably fallen, we might seek transcendence or evolutionary transformation. If we see ourselves as trapped but complicit, we face uncomfortable moral ambiguity. The Gnostics chose stark answers. The world was evil, escape was necessary, ordinary reality was deception. Few can maintain such radical positions today. We're too embedded in material existence, too dependent on systems we simultaneously critique, too aware of our own complicity. But perhaps the value of Gnostic thought is not its answers, but its refusal of easy consolation. It won't tell you everything is fundamentally okay, that suffering serves divine purposes, that justice will ultimately prevail. It insists instead that something is profoundly wrong, that reality as given must be questioned, that liberation requires more than adjustment to circumstances. This is uncomfortable knowledge. It's easier to accept the world as it is, to find meaning within given structures, to trust that authorities know what they're doing. The Gnostic refusal of these comforts made it dangerous to orthodoxies of every kind, religious, political, philosophical. Yet the refusal preserves something essential: the human capacity to say no, to reject what claims to be inevitable, to question what presents as natural, to imagine alternatives to what exists. This capacity, call it the divine spark, critical consciousness, or simply freedom, is perhaps the most precious thing humans possess. It's fragile, easily crushed or co-opted, or forgotten. Systems work constantly to contain it, channel it, neutralize it. The Archons fear nothing more than humans who see clearly and refuse to play assigned roles. This is why Gnosis was always dangerous, and why those who possessed it were persecuted. But it's indestructible in the end. You can burn books, execute teachers, suppress movements, but you can't extinguish the capacity for questions. Each generation must discover for itself that something is wrong, that reality admits alternatives, that freedom is possible. Each must undergo its own awakening. The Nag Hammadi codices, emerging from Egyptian earth after 16 centuries, testify to this indestructibility. They were buried to preserve them. They survived through faith that someday someone would need to read them. That faith was vindicated when Muhammad Ali's mattock struck the jar. We are the someones, living in a world that needs these questions asked again, facing systems that require the Gnostic critique, searching for resources to resist modern Archons. The ancient texts don't give us blueprints, but they give us companionship, evidence that others have faced cosmic alienation, asked forbidden questions, and refused the easy answers. Perhaps this is what it means for the spark to remember, not recovering historical facts, but recognizing ourselves in ancient struggles, seeing our present crisis reflected in old myths, hearing our questions in texts that predated our civilization. The recognition that we are not alone, that alienation has voice and tradition, that saying no to the world's false totalities is ancient practice. The rebellion of the soul was never against the gods. That was how orthodoxy framed it, making Gnostics into rebels against divine authority. The rebellion was against forgetting who we are, beings capable of consciousness, meaning and freedom, even in systems designed to deny these capacities. This is the spark's memory, that we are more than the systems that use us, more than our conditioning, more than our circumstances. Not because we have immortal souls, maybe we do, maybe we don't, but because consciousness itself exceeds its material conditions even while depending on them. It's a modest gnosis for modest times, not cosmic escape, but simple refusal, not guaranteed salvation, but contingent resistance, not transcendent certainty, but imminent hope. The prison remains, but we see its walls. The Archons persist, but we know their names. The material world continues its entropic decay, but consciousness kindles meaning in the darkness. And if that's all the spark can do, kindle meaning, assert freedom, maintain awareness, perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's what the divine spark was always about. Not a substance to preserve, but a capacity to exercise. Not a treasure to guard, but a fire to share. The Gnostic story does not end because it never truly begins. It has no single origin, no definitive conclusion. It's the recurring pattern of awakening and forgetting, rebellion and suppression, knowledge and ignorance. As long as humans experience alienation and seek liberation, the Gnostic pattern will re-emerge. Muhammad Ali could not have known, breaking open that ancient jar, that he was releasing something more than texts. He was releasing questions that refuse to stay buried, memories that persist despite millennia of forgetting, voices insisting that reality is not what we've been told. The dust has settled, the words remain, and in the silence, if we listen, we can hear them still. Wake up, remember, refuse, the spark endures.